Your sister wants the master bedroom. My mother's shrill voice echoed through the phone on my very first night in the $1.2 million beach house. You are childless. So keeping a house that big all to yourself is just selfish. I did not argue or cry. I simply texted, "Come at 10 in the morning." When their moving truck pulled up the next morning, I was waiting on the porch not with the heavy brass keys, but with a single, sealed letter from the late owner. Vanessa practically ripped it from my hand, but as her eyes scanned the very first line, all the arrogant color drained from her face. If you have ever had to teach an entitled family member that your boundaries are carved in stone, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe, because you will not want to miss how this execution unfolds. Exactly 2 weeks before that moving truck arrived, I was sitting in my quiet downtown office when the probate attorney called with the news that would change my life. My name is Amy. I am 34 years old, and I spend my days working as an estate and trust auditor. It is a profession built entirely in the shadows of other people's wealth. My daily routine involves combing through dense financial ledgers, tracking offshore wire transfers, and identifying the microscopic digital footprints left behind by heirs trying to hide assets from the federal government. I do not wear designer clothes. I wear sensible navy slacks and practical flat shoes, blending into the background while I untangle the complicated, often toxic webs of generational money. I adopted this quiet, accommodating posture long before I ever stepped foot into a corporate accounting firm. It was a survival mechanism forged in the fires of my own family dynamic. My mother, Barbara, is 62 years old and treats social status as her personal religion. My younger sister, Vanessa, is 30 years old, has 3 children, and operates under the absolute conviction that her fertility entitles her to the world's endless resources. For the past decade, I have been the silent financial shock absorber for their reckless choices. When Vanessa maxed out her credit cards buying luxury strollers and imported nursery furniture, I was the one quietly paying the minimum balances so her power would not get shut off. I never asked for gratitude, and they certainly never offered it. They looked at my quiet, childless life and saw nothing but a blank canvas they could paint their own demands across. But there was one person who saw past my accommodating facade. His name was Elias Thorne. Elias was 82 years old, a retired federal judge, and one of my firm's most complex clients. For 5 years, I sat across from him in heavily air-conditioned conference rooms, meticulously organizing the architecture of his massive estate. Elias was a man carved from granite. He had sharp, assessing eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He did not care for small talk or superficial flattery. He cared about precision, logic, and the rule of law. During our long auditing sessions, Elias would occasionally ask me about my life outside the firm. I kept my answers brief and polite, deflecting the conversation away from the constant financial drains my mother and sister placed on me. But Elias was a federal judge. He spent his entire career reading people who thought they were successfully hiding the truth. He noticed my worn-out shoes. He noticed the dark circles under my eyes when I picked up extra auditing contracts to cover Vanessa's emergency dental bills. He watched me quietly manage hundreds of millions of dollars for strangers while I ate stale sandwiches at my desk. He saw the silent, heavy sacrifices I made, and he recognized the cold competence I buried beneath my quiet demeanor. When my desk phone rang that crisp Tuesday morning, I assumed it was a standard clerical question regarding a tax filing. Instead, the voice on the other end belonged to Elias's primary probate attorney. He informed me, his tone thick with solemn formality, that Elias had passed away peacefully in his sleep the night before. He then requested my immediate presence at his law firm. An hour later, I sat in a high-backed leather chair across from a massive mahogany desk. The probate attorney did not offer me a cup of coffee or engage in hollow condolences. He simply opened his briefcase and retrieved a thick, black leather binder sealed with a heavy silver clasp. He placed it squarely in the center of the desk. Beside the binder, he placed a heavy iron ring holding 2 pristine brass keys. Elias was an incredibly deliberate man. Amy, the attorney stated, lacing his fingers together over the desk. He spent the last year of his life restructuring his private holdings. He observed your situation closely. He recognized that you spend your entire life building safety nets for people who do not appreciate you. He wanted to ensure that you finally had a sanctuary of your own. The attorney pushed the keys slightly closer to my side of the desk. He left it to you, Amy, the property in the Outer Banks. It is completely paid off, free and clear of any outstanding liens or encumbrances. I sat perfectly still. My hands rested flat against the fabric of my slacks. I did not gasp or cry. My analytical mind instantly tried to process the mathematical impossibility of the statement. The Outer Banks property was Elias's crown jewel. I had seen the tax assessments during my audits. It was an expansive, private coastal estate valued at exactly $1.2 million. There must be a mistake, I said, my voice steady but incredibly tight. I was his auditor. I am not blood. You cannot transfer an asset of that magnitude to a non-relative without triggering a massive review. The attorney offered a small, knowing smile. Elias was a federal judge. Amy. He wrote the reviews. The transfer is ironclad, but he also left a very specific set of instructions. The attorney tapped the thick leather binder. Elias knew exactly how your mother and your sister operate. He knew that the moment they smelled blood in the water, they would descend on this property like vultures. He knew they would try to guilt you, bully you, and shame you into surrendering it to them because you do not have children. I swallowed hard, the uncomfortable truth of his words tightening my chest. The attorney slid the heavy binder across the polished wood. Elias did not just leave you a house, Amy, he left you a fortress. The deed is secured, but the land itself is tethered to a very specific legal structure. He wanted you to have a place to rest, but he also wanted to arm you with a weapon just in case your family tried to break down the door. I reached out and placed my hand on the cold leather cover of the binder. The weight of Elias's gift was staggering. He had given me the one thing I had never possessed: leverage. I left the law firm, drove straight to my modest apartment, packed a single overnight bag, and pointed my car toward the coast. The drive took 3 hours, the dense concrete skyline of the city gradually giving way to the open, salt-heavy air of the Atlantic. I turned off the main coastal highway, my tires crunching against a private, crushed seashell driveway completely hidden behind a towering row of ancient maritime oaks. When the trees cleared, I pressed the brake pedal, bringing the car to a slow, silent halt. The house was magnificent. It was a sprawling, 2-story structure clad in weathered cedar shingles, featuring a massive wraparound porch that stared directly out into the churning gray waters of the ocean. There were no neighboring houses in sight. The wind whipped through the tall dune grasses, carrying the fierce, undeniable sound of absolute isolation. I stepped out of the car, the coastal wind instantly tearing at my hair. I walked up the wooden steps, the heavy brass keys clinking together in my trembling hand. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and pushed it open. The interior smelled of old wood, sea salt, and profound quiet. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the ocean perfectly. It was a space designed for peace. It was a space designed for a life that belonged entirely to me. I walked into the center of the vast living room and stood there listening to the waves crash against the shoreline. I stared at the heavy brass keys in my hand, knowing with absolute certainty that the moment my family found out about this beautiful coastal sanctuary, they would try to tear it out of my hands. The peace of the Outer Banks was violently shattered precisely 48 hours later, when a silver Mercedes SUV aggressively mounted my pristine gravel driveway. The heavy tires kicked up a violent cloud of crushed white seashells, the vehicle swerving slightly before slamming on the brakes mere inches from the bottom of my wooden porch stairs. The driver's side door swung open, hitting the damp, salt-heavy coastal wind with a sharp metallic thud. Out stepped Vanessa. She wore oversized designer sunglasses, a pristine white cashmere sweater completely inappropriate for the rugged ocean environment, and a deep scowl that hardened her features. From the passenger side emerged my mother, Barbara, She clutched a heavy leather handbag tightly against her chest like a shield. Her perfectly sprayed hair immediately fighting a losing battle against the relentless coastal breeze. They had not come to congratulate me. They had not come to mourn Elias Thorne. I stood motionless on the expansive wraparound porch, a warm ceramic mug of black coffee resting quietly in my hands. I watched them march up my steps, their designer heels clicking sharply against the weathered cedar planks. Vanessa did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. She reached into her oversized leather tote, pulled out a crumpled stack of white printer paper, and slapped it aggressively against the wooden railing. "Public County tax records. Amy," Vanessa snapped, her voice cutting harshly through the rhythmic sound of the crashing waves. "Did you honestly think you could hide a $1.2 million property transfer from us?" Trent gets automatic digital alerts for high-value coastal reassignments. Imagine his absolute surprise when my spinster sister's name popped up on the registry for a 5-bedroom beachfront estate. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The bitter, dark roast grounded my senses. I did not invite them inside. I did not step aside to let them pass. I stood exactly where I was, my posture perfectly straight, forcing them to remain on the lower steps, looking up at me. Barbara pushed her way past Vanessa, resting her manicured hand heavily on the wooden banister. She looked past my shoulder, her eyes scanning the floor-to-ceiling windows and the pristine cedar siding with undisguised, predatory hunger. "It is absolutely shameful, Amy," Barbara said, shaking her head with an expression of manufactured, theatrical disgust. "Sneaking around, swindling an 82-year-old man on his deathbed. I raised you to have better morals than this. What on earth did you do to manipulate a federal judge into leaving you a house you have absolutely no use for?" "It does not matter how she manipulated him, Mom," Vanessa interrupted, crossing her arms tightly. Her massive diamond wedding band caught the fading sunlight, flashing brightly. "What matters is that this property belongs in the family trust. Look at this place." Vanessa sneered, gesturing wildly at the expansive deck and the private beach access beyond it. "This is a family home. You are 34 years old. You are completely alone. You have no husband. You are entirely childless. What exactly are you going to do with 5 bedrooms and 3,000 square feet of oceanfront property? Sit in the corner and stare at your spreadsheets." Vanessa took another step up, her eyes blazing with raw, unadulterated entitlement. "I have 3 children, Amy. Your nieces and nephews are practically suffocating in our current house. They need the space. They need the fresh air. I need the master suite facing the water for my mental health. You taking this house is a direct insult to my family." "Your sister is actually building a legacy," Barbara chimed in, stepping closer, her tone shifting seamlessly from maternal disappointment to aggressive entitlement. "She is raising the next generation. Your life, bless your heart, is entirely meaningless outside of your little corporate cubicle. Keeping a $1.2 million asset all to yourself while your sister's family struggles for space is not just selfish, it is repulsive. You have a duty to provide for the bloodline." I did not flinch. I did not defend my choices. I did not justify my quiet, childless life, nor did I explain the grueling 80-hour work weeks I had endured to clean up their financial messes for the past decade. I did not remind Vanessa that I had paid her overdue credit card bills just 3 months ago so her children would not lose their electricity. Engaging with narcissists only provides them with the oxygen they desperately need to keep their fire burning. Instead, I offered them nothing but a cold, impenetrable, and terrifying silence. My silence hit Vanessa like a physical blow. She thrived on chaotic, screaming arguments. She lived for the drama of escalating conflicts. She expected me to cry, to apologize, to fold under the immense weight of our mother's relentless guilt trips, just as I always had when I was younger, when I simply took another slow sip of my coffee, refusing to give her a single word of validation. The skin on her neck flushed a violent shade of red. She lunged up the final 3 steps, entirely closing the physical distance between us. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, her sharp acrylic nail hovering just an inch from my collarbone. "You are going to sign the deed over to Trent," Vanessa demanded, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated greed. "Trent is a commercial real estate broker. He actually understands how to manage high-value assets. He will put the title under his limited liability company to protect it from the taxes you obviously cannot afford to pay. You are going to go to a notary this afternoon, and you are going to transfer the property to the people who actually deserve it." Trent. The moment she spoke his name, the true architecture of their ambush snapped into perfect focus in my mind. Vanessa was greedy, but she lacked the financial vocabulary to orchestrate a property transfer. Trent, her arrogant, over-leveraged husband, was the one pulling the strings. He was the one monitoring the coastal tax registries. He was using his wife and my mother as blunt instruments to batter me into surrendering a massive, unencumbered asset. "It is the only decent thing to do, Amy," Barbara added, nodding emphatically, completely oblivious to the financial mechanics at play. "If you do not sign it over today, you are essentially stealing from your own family. You will be entirely cut off. I will make sure everyone in the family, everyone at the country club, knows exactly how greedy and heartless you have become." I slowly lowered my coffee mug. I looked at Vanessa's shaking, demanding finger, then shifted my gaze to my mother's furious, entitled expression. I reached into the pocket of my navy slacks and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated, casting a pale glow against the darkening coastal sky. "The property lines end at the gravel perimeter," I stated, my voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "You are currently trespassing. If you do not return to your vehicle in the next 30 seconds, I will call the local authorities and have you physically removed from my porch." Vanessa gasped, her jaw dropping open in absolute shock. She looked at Barbara, completely bewildered by the cold steel in my voice. She had expected a victim. She had not expected an auditor. "You would not dare," Vanessa hissed, her fists clenching tightly at her sides. "You are nothing without this family. Amy, you are a pathetic, lonely accountant playing dress-up in a dead man's house. Trent is going to get involved now. You have no idea what kind of resources he has. He will tie you up in probate court until you are completely bankrupt." I did not offer a rebuttal. I did not match her screaming pitch. I simply held my phone up, my thumb hovering deliberately over the emergency dial button. I stared directly into Vanessa's eyes, holding her gaze with absolute, unyielding authority. I began counting down the seconds in perfect, suffocating silence. Barbara grabbed Vanessa's arm, yanking her backward down the wooden stairs. "Leave her, Vanessa," Barbara spat, her voice trembling with raw indignation. "She has clearly lost her mind. Let Trent handle the legalities. She will be begging us for forgiveness when the property taxes and the maintenance fees bury her." Vanessa stomped back to the silver SUV, her designer heels sinking deeply into the crushed white seashells. She yanked the driver's side door open and slid behind the wheel, glaring at me through the glass windshield. The engine roared to life with an aggressive, revving surge of power. She threw the vehicle into reverse, spinning the heavy tires and violently kicking a spray of gravel across the pristine coastal dune grass. I stood motionless on the wraparound porch, the cold ocean wind whipping my hair across my face, watching the heavy luxury vehicle tear out of the driveway and merge recklessly onto the main coastal highway. As their taillights faded into the evening fog, I realized this was no longer just a pathetic family disagreement. It was the opening salvo of an absolute financial war. By Tuesday morning, Barbara had successfully weaponized the entire extended family and her country club social circle against me. The absolute tranquility of the coastal morning, accompanied only by the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic waves against the shoreline, was starkly interrupted by the relentless, synchronized buzzing of my smartphone. It sat on the polished granite kitchen island, vibrating so violently and continuously that it began inching its way toward the edge of the countertop. I did not rush to silence it. I calmly finished pouring hot water over my coffee grounds, watching the dark liquid bloom and filter into my ceramic mug. I picked up the mug, walked over to the island, and finally looked down at the glowing screen. There were 42 missed calls, 78 unread text messages, and 12 new voicemails. The digital assault was highly coordinated, executing a strategy my mother had perfected over 3 decades. When private intimidation failed, Barbara always deployed public humiliation. I unlocked the screen and tapped the voicemail icon, placing the phone on speaker while I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The first message was from Aunt Susan, my mother's older sister, whose voice trembled with a manufactured, theatrical sorrow. "Amy, I just got off the phone with your mother." Aunt Susan's recorded voice echoed through the quiet kitchen. "I am absolutely sick to my stomach. Barbara is in tears. She told me how you manipulated that poor, 82-year-old client of yours into signing over his property on his deathbed. How could you do something so devious? And to hoard a 5-bedroom mansion all to yourself while Vanessa's 3 children are practically sleeping on top of each other in that cramped house. You have always been stubborn, Amy. But this level of greed is a sin. You need to call your mother, apologize, and sign that deed over to Trent immediately before you destroy this family entirely." I tapped the screen, archiving the message into a newly created folder labeled Harassment Evidence. The next voicemail was from Cousin Helen, a woman I had not spoken to in 4 years, yet who suddenly felt entitled to weigh in on my financial assets. Her tone lacked Aunt Susan's religious guilt, it was purely aggressive. "Listen to me, Amy," Helen snapped, the background noise of her car radio bleeding into the microphone. "We all know you hate the fact that Vanessa actually built a real family while you chose to be a lonely career woman. But stealing a house to spite her is pathetic. Trent is a real estate professional. He knows you cannot afford the upkeep or the property taxes on a $1.2 million estate. Stop being a selfish, vindictive spinster and give the house to the kids, who actually need a backyard." The narrative Barbara had spun was a masterpiece of character assassination. She had seamlessly inverted reality, in her version of events. I was not the dedicated estate auditor who had dutifully served Elias Thorne for 5 years. I was a predatory opportunist guilty of elder abuse. Furthermore, she expertly struck the precise psychological nerve that resonated with her conservative, suburban network my childless status, by framing my lack of children as a moral defect and a sign of inherent selfishness. She instantly transformed Vanessa into the ultimate sympathetic victim, a struggling, devoted mother being maliciously deprived of a home by her wealthy, unfeeling sister. I did not delete the voicemails. I did not text Helen back to defend myself. I did not call Aunt Susan to explain that Elias Thorne was a former federal judge with a mind sharper than a steel trap until the very minute he passed away. Instead, I carried my coffee to my laptop, booted up my encrypted workstation, and began downloading every single audio file, text message, and email. As an auditor, I do not process emotional attacks. I process data. I log the timestamps, the senders, and the exact verbiage they used. They thought they were breaking me down. In reality, they were blindly handing me a pristine, documented trail of coercion and defamation. By early afternoon, the private harassment escalated into a public spectacle. Vanessa, realizing that my phone remained stubbornly silent, moved the campaign to social media. I opened my browser and navigated to her page. She had posted a highly curated, black-and-white photograph of her 3 children looking despondent while sitting on a worn-out sofa in their current living room. The caption below the photo was a masterclass in passive-aggressive venom. "It breaks a mother's heart when you realize some people value hoarded wealth and empty rooms over the happiness of their own flesh and blood. Praying for certain family members to find the light and realize that a house is meaningless if you are too selfish to share it with the children who desperately need it. We will keep fighting for what is right for our family." She did not name me directly, but she did not have to. The comment section was a roaring mob of Barbara's country club associates, Vanessa's suburban neighbors, and extended relatives. Women I had never met were leaving paragraphs of absolute outrage, calling me a monster, a sterile sociopath, and a greedy spinster. They promised to boycott any firm that employed me. They tagged local news stations, suggesting my professional licenses should be revoked for preying on the elderly. Years ago, this level of coordinated social pressure would have crushed me when I was 25 years old. Barbara had used this exact same tactic to force me into paying $45,000 to cover Vanessa's lavish wedding catering. She had spent weeks calling my relatives, claiming my refusal to contribute was going to publicly humiliate the family and ruin Vanessa's special day. I remembered the suffocating, paralyzing weight of a dozen family members calling me selfish and ungrateful. I had eventually broken down, drained my modest savings account, and handed over the money just to make the relentless harassment stop. They expected that same terrified, compliant 25-year-old girl to answer the phone today. They expected the crushing weight of public shame to force me to the negotiating table. They severely miscalculated. I was 34 years old now. I had spent a decade navigating the ruthless, cutthroat world of corporate trusts and estate law. I had audited billionaires who would sell their own siblings for a fraction of a percent in profit margins. I knew exactly how fragile an extortionist's leverage truly was. I clicked a button on my browser, capturing a full-page, high-resolution screenshot of Vanessa's post and every single defamatory comment beneath it. I saved the image file directly into my evidence folder. I did not block them. And I did not lock my social media profiles. I left all the channels of communication wide open, an inviting, silent void designed to encourage their absolute worst instincts. When you refuse to react to a narcissist, the sudden lack of friction completely derails their strategy. They require your defensive panic to validate their power. Met with absolute unyielding silence, they do not retreat. They panic. And in their panic, they inevitably overextend. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone rang again. The caller identification displayed my mother's number. I let it ring. The screen went dark, and a moment later, a new voicemail notification popped up. I hit play, leaning back in my chair, watching the gray ocean waves crash violently against the shore through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You are ignoring us, Amy." Barbara's voice hissed through the speaker, the mask of the weeping grandmother completely gone, replaced by raw, venomous fury. "You think you can just hide in that house and ignore this family? You are a stubborn, arrogant fool. Your reputation is completely destroyed. Half the congregation at church knows exactly what you did to that old man. You will never be able to show your face in this family again." She paused, taking a sharp, ragged breath, her voice lowering into a tone of absolute, commanding entitlement. "You brought this public humiliation on yourself, but Trent is going to fix it. He is reviewing the legal options right now, and he knows exactly how to handle people who try to steal from this family. You are going to sign that property over to him. Amy, you have no choice left. If you do not answer your phone by tomorrow, Trent will be taking matters into his own hands, and he will not be nearly as polite as I am." The voicemail clicked off, plunging the kitchen back into the peaceful, quiet rhythm of the ocean outside. I picked up my ceramic mug and took one final sip of my coffee. The liquid was cold, but it tasted like absolute clarity. Barbara had just officially introduced her son-in-law into the equation, explicitly threatening me with his supposed legal and financial prowess. I filed the final audio recording into the encrypted folder on my desktop. They desperately wanted me isolated, suffocated by the heavy weight of social pressure, completely unaware that silence is an auditor's most lethal weapon. Trent arrived unannounced on a rainy Thursday, wearing a bespoke Italian suit and a smile that oozed predatory condescension. The coastal storm had rolled in just before dawn, turning the Atlantic into a churning expanse of slate gray and battering the cedar shingles of the house with heavy, rhythmic sheets of water. I was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a mug of herbal tea, when the harsh crunch of tires on wet gravel announced his arrival. A black luxury sedan parked at a careless, aggressive angle near the porch stairs. Trent stepped out, instantly pulling a large black umbrella over his head to protect his slicked-back hair and expensive tailoring from the coastal downpour. He jogged up the wooden steps, not bothering to knock before turning the heavy brass handle. I had left the door unlocked for the contractor scheduled to inspect the roof, a detail Trent immediately exploited. He pushed the door open, wiping his leather shoes on the entryway mat with exaggerated, heavy stomps. "Amy," Trent announced, closing the door behind him and shaking the rainwater from his umbrella. He did not wait for an invitation to proceed further into the house. He walked directly into the massive living room, his eyes darting across the vaulted ceilings, the stone fireplace, and the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the violent ocean. He let out a low, whistling breath, running his hand along the polished granite countertop as he approached the kitchen island. Not bad at all for an old man's retirement pad, a bit dated in the fixtures, but the bones are solid. I remained seated on my stool, my hands wrapped around my warm ceramic mug. I did not offer him a towel. I did not offer him a drink. I simply watched his eyes calculate the square footage. "What do you want, Trent?" I asked, my voice flat and completely devoid of hospitality. Trent laughed. A short, abrasive sound. He pulled out one of the high-backed wooden bar stools and sat down directly across from me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the granite, steepling his fingers together in a practiced pose of corporate authority. "I am here to help you, Amy," Trent said, dropping his voice into a hushed, patronizing register. "Your mother and Vanessa are highly emotional right now. You know how they get. They are blinded by the sentimental idea of a family beach house. But I am a commercial real estate broker. I operate on logic, not emotion. I drove 3 hours out here in a monsoon because I know you are entirely in over your head." He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek, leather-bound folder. He flipped it open, revealing a stack of freshly printed documents. "You see a beautiful ocean view," Trent continued, tapping his index finger against the top page. "I see a massive, unavoidable liability. Do you have any idea how coastal zoning laws function? Are you aware of the specialized hurricane insurance premiums required for a property sitting this close to the waterline? The annual property taxes alone on a $1.2 million estate will completely bankrupt a standard corporate accountant within 24 months. He was mansplaining basic property finance to a senior estate and trust auditor. The sheer, blinding arrogance required to sit in my kitchen and assume I was financially illiterate was staggering. I had spent the last 10 years dismantling the tax shelters of multi-billion-dollar hedge funds. Yet Trent looked at me and saw nothing but a naive, childless spinster who needed a man to balance her checkbook. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I tilted my head slightly, allowing him the space to dig his grave deeper. "Vanessa told me you drained your savings just a few years ago." Trent lied smoothly, fabricating a narrative to fit his agenda. He conveniently ignored the fact that I had drained those savings explicitly to pay for his wife's extravagant wedding catering. "You cannot afford this upkeep, Amy. And with the absolute public relations disaster your mother has unleashed on your reputation back home, you are facing a massive social exile. You need a clean break." Trent slid a thick, stapled document across the granite island. It stopped exactly 1 inch from my tea mug. "This is a standard purchase agreement," Trent declared, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms with smug satisfaction. "I am willing to establish a limited liability company and take the title off your hands today. I will assume all the tax liabilities, the maintenance costs, and the coastal insurance premiums. I will even write you a personal check for $50,000 right now. It is a more than generous buyout. Considering the massive financial burden I am lifting off your shoulders, you take the cash, you apologize to your mother, and this entire ugly family dispute disappears." He smiled, a wide, predatory grin that showed too many teeth. He genuinely believed he had backed me into a corner. He thought the combination of Barbara's social smear campaign and his exaggerated financial threats would terrify me into signing away a $1.2 million asset for $50,000. I did not look at the purchase agreement. I looked at Trent. I applied the exact same clinical observation skills I used when auditing hostile corporate executives. I stopped listening to his arrogant words and started reading his physical reality. The bespoke Italian suit he wore was beautiful from a distance, but up close, the stitching on the left cuff was noticeably frayed, a sign it was an older piece that had not been replaced. He was wearing a heavy luxury watch, but his left hand trembled with a subtle, high-frequency tremor every time he lifted it off the counter. Despite the freezing rain outside and the cool temperature inside the house, a distinct line of perspiration had formed along his hairline. He kept swallowing, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his silk collar, and his right foot tapped a frantic, erratic rhythm against the metal rung of the bar stool beneath him. These were not the physical tells of a wealthy investor looking for a bargain. These were the visceral, uncontrollable biological reactions of a man actively drowning in toxic debt. My mind rapidly assembled the puzzle pieces. The commercial real estate market had recently suffered a massive downtown contraction. A broker like Trent, whose entire identity was built on aggressive leverage and flashy commissions, would be the first to bleed. He was sweating because he was desperate. He did not want this house so his children could play in the sand. He needed a $1.2 million unencumbered asset to use as collateral. He was facing an imminent margin call, and without a massive injection of capital, his entire fraudulent empire was going to collapse. He was looking at Elias Thorne's property as his personal, highly illegal bailout. "Well," Trent pushed, his foot tapping faster against the bar stool. The silence was clearly shredding his nerves. "I do not have all day, Amy. Sign the agreement. I have a notary waiting down the street." I reached out and placed my index finger on the center of his purchase agreement. I did not pull it toward me. I pushed it slowly, deliberately, straight back across the granite island until it hung precariously over the edge on his side. "The door is behind you, Trent," I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet hum that resonated with absolute, uncompromising authority. Trent's smug smile vanished instantly, his face contorted, the polite, condescending brother-in-law facade shattering to reveal a core of desperate, vindictive rage. He slammed his hand flat onto the granite, the sharp crack echoing loudly over the sound of the rain hitting the windows. "You are a stupid, arrogant woman," Trent hissed, leaning heavily across the island, his breath smelling faintly of stale coffee and pure panic. "You think you can play games with me? I deal with ruthless developers every single day. I will tie this property up in so much litigation you will not be able to sell a single grain of sand. You will drown in legal fees. Amy, you will be entirely bankrupt before the end of the year." I did not blink. I did not lean away from him. I held his furious, bloodshot gaze, my face a mask of cold, unyielding stone. "If you do not leave my house in the next 10 seconds, I replied softly, "I will have you arrested for trespassing, and I will personally mail the police report to the State Real Estate Licensing Board." Trent froze, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles visibly bulged beneath his skin. He realized, in that split second, that screaming at me was entirely useless. He snatched the purchase agreement off the counter, shoving it violently into his leather folder. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. He did not offer another threat. He straightened his silk tie with jerky, uncoordinated movements, snatched his umbrella from the entryway, and marched out the front door, slamming it so hard the glass panes rattled in their wooden frames. I sat quietly in my kitchen, listening to the aggressive roar of his sedan's engine as he reversed recklessly out of my gravel driveway and sped away into the coastal storm. He walked out the door believing he had successfully intimidated a naive spinster, completely missing the fact that I had just mentally audited his desperate, crumbling financial facade. The moment Trent's luxury sedan disappeared down the coastal highway, I brewed a pot of black coffee and booted up my encrypted workstation. The coastal storm continued to batter the exterior of the house, throwing violent sheets of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat at the expansive granite kitchen island, swapping my tepid mug of herbal tea for a heavy ceramic cup filled with a dark, bitter roast. The trembling, naive spinster that Trent believed he had just intimidated, ceased to exist. I logged out of my personal email and launched the proprietary, high-security auditing software I utilized for complex federal trust investigations. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue glow across my face in the dim kitchen. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the lingering sting of his threats. I felt the cold, terrifyingly sharp focus that overtakes me the moment I begin a forensic financial dissection. I started with the State Registry of Corporations. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the rhythmic clacking echoing against the vaulted cedar ceilings. I typed Trent's full legal name into the search bar and executed a deep query. The database churned for a fraction of a second before returning a sprawling, chaotic digital web of limited liability companies. Trent operated a primary commercial brokerage firm, but the screen showed he had spun off over a dozen subsidiary holding companies over the past 4 years. It was a classic, amateur camouflage technique. Arrogant brokers frequently construct convoluted corporate architectures to project a massive institutional footprint, hoping to mask the fact that they are operating a hollow shell. I bypassed the impressive-sounding corporate names and drove directly into the foundation of his operation, the Uniform Commercial Code filings. The UCC database is the absolute lifeblood of commercial debt. It is where lenders publicly record their secured interests against a borrower's assets. Liars can fabricate tax returns and inflate appraisals, but they cannot hide from the UCC ledger. I initiated a cross-reference between Trent's primary limited liability company and the county tax records. The results populated my screen in a cascading waterfall of data. I began exporting the raw numbers into a master spreadsheet, formatting the columns to trace the flow of capital. Within 20 minutes, the pristine white background of my monitor was bleeding with bright red ink. Trent was not a successful commercial real estate broker. He was a man actively standing on the gallows, waiting for the floor to drop. 3 years ago, he had acquired a massive, failing commercial strip mall on the outskirts of a declining suburban district. The purchase price was recorded at $6.5 million. Instead of securing traditional, fixed-rate financing, Trent had utilized a highly volatile floating-rate commercial loan, betting heavily on the market remaining stable. It was the financial equivalent of playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded cylinder. When the prime interest rates aggressively climbed over the past 18 months, his monthly debt obligations skyrocketed. The spreadsheet clearly illustrated the catastrophic timeline. His debt service coverage ratio plummeted. The commercial strip mall was not generating nearly enough rental income to cover the massive monthly interest payments. I pulled the municipal court dockets to check for secondary fallout. The search yielded a devastating list of active civil litigation. 4 separate general contractors had filed mechanics liens against Trent's primary brokerage firm for unpaid renovations on the commercial property. A roofing company, 2 electrical contractors, and a commercial plumbing outfit were actively suing him for a combined total of $420,000 in unpaid invoices. He was bleeding liquidity from every conceivable corporate artery, but the sheer incompetence of his financial structure did not stop there. I traced the capital he had used to secure the initial down payment for the failing strip mall. The red lines on my monitor connected his commercial holding company directly to a secondary residential mortgage. My jaw tightened as the reality of the transaction crystallized on the screen. Trent had cross-collateralized his assets. He had taken out a massive, high-risk secondary mortgage on the sprawling, 5-bedroom suburban home where Vanessa and her 3 children lived. He had pledged his own family's shelter as collateral to fund a reckless commercial gamble. He was actively risking his children's roof while simultaneously demanding I surrender my inheritance because my childless life was somehow deemed selfish. The sheer, blinding hypocrisy of his entitlement radiated from the glowing pixels. I took a slow sip of the black coffee, the bitter caffeine sharpening my focus as I hunted for the kill shot. A man drowning in this much toxic debt does not drive 3 hours in a coastal monsoon just to secure a vacation home. He was hunting for immediate survival. I dug into the mezzanine debt registries. searching for short-term, predatory financing vehicles designed for desperate borrowers. It took exactly 12 minutes to locate the fatal blow. 8 months ago, frantic to avoid defaulting on the primary strip mall loan, Trent had secured a massive bridge loan from a ruthless private equity firm. The principal amount was $2.5 million. The terms of the loan were publicly recorded, and they were absolutely draconian. He had agreed to a punitive interest rate, and more importantly, the loan featured a massive balloon payment. I highlighted the maturity date on the contract. The entire principal balance of $2.5 million was due in exactly 14 days. If Trent failed to deliver the capital in 2 weeks, the private equity firm would trigger a catastrophic cross-default clause. They would not just seize the failing commercial strip mall, they would seize his primary brokerage firm, freeze all of his corporate operating accounts, and initiate an immediate foreclosure on the suburban home where my sister and her children slept. The puzzle pieces locked together with devastating, absolute clarity. Trent did not want Elias Thorne's coastal sanctuary to build a family legacy. He needed a $1.2 million unencumbered asset, a property owned completely free and clear of any debt to pledge as fresh collateral. If he could successfully bully me into signing a quitclaim deed, transferring the title into his limited liability company, he could immediately leverage the beach house to secure a restructuring loan and stave off his impending bankruptcy. He was trying to steal my inheritance to plug a massive, gaping hole in a sinking ship. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, resting my hands flat on my thighs. The rhythmic, violent sound of the ocean storm outside mirrored the turbulent, explosive reality of my family's financial state. I realized, with a profound sense of chilling clarity, that Vanessa and Barbara's hysterical public smear campaign was not entirely born of their own spontaneous jealousy. Trent had orchestrated this. He had likely lied to them, feeding their narcissistic entitlement, telling them this house was the key to securing their generational wealth while masking his impending total ruin. He had weaponized his wife and my mother, aiming them at me like blunt instruments, hoping the sheer weight of social and familial pressure would crack my resolve before his creditors cracked his bank accounts. He was using their arrogance as a shield to hide his sheer, unadulterated terror. I turned back to the glowing monitor. I opened a new, encrypted digital dossier. I began exporting every single document, every court docket, every recorded lien, and the catastrophic balloon payment contract. I meticulously organized the files, building an ironclad, undeniable portfolio of his financial death sentence. I did not feel anger toward the man who had just threatened me in my own kitchen. I felt the cold, methodical anticipation of an auditor who had just uncovered a fatal discrepancy. He wasn't just a snob seeking a free vacation home. He was a desperate, drowning fraudster looking for a $1.2 million life raft. And he was about to drag my family into the abyss. While I was systematically tracing Trent's offshore debt, my mother and sister were actively crossing the line from emotional abuse into severe federal criminality. The coastal storm raged through Thursday night and finally broke by late Friday morning, leaving the sky a bruised, heavy gray. I had not slept. The pale blue light of my monitor reflected in my eyes as I sat perfectly still at the granite kitchen island. I was monitoring the digital tripwires I had established on Elias Thorne's estate. As a senior estate auditor, I knew that desperate people rarely wait patiently when bankruptcy is breathing down their necks. I had registered my name with the county's automated property fraud alert system the very moment the probate attorney handed me the heavy brass keys. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a sharp metallic chime cut through the quiet kitchen. An automated email appeared in my encrypted inbox. The sender was the County Register of Deeds. The subject line indicated a new filing attached to my specific parcel number. I clicked the secure link, a portable document format file downloaded to my desktop. The title read, Quitclaim Deed Transfer. I opened the file, my eyes scanning the text with clinical precision. The document was neatly typed on standard legal paper, bearing the polished, authoritative header of Trent's commercial brokerage firm, The grantor was listed as my full legal name. The grantee was listed as Trent's primary limited liability company, the exact same corporate entity that was currently collapsing under the weight of a $2.5 million balloon payment. The consideration for the transfer was listed as $10, a standard legal fiction used to bypass heavy taxation on intrafamily property transfers. Trent was officially attempting to steal a $1.2 million coastal estate using a scanner and a printer. I moved my mouse, zooming in on the signature line at the bottom of the second page. My eyes analyzed the black ink. It was my signature, but it entirely lacked the fluid, rapid kinetic energy of a live, handwritten stroke. The edges of the letters were slightly jagged, vibrating with a microscopic tremor. It was a classic, undeniable hallmark of a manual tracing. The ink density was entirely uniform, completely lacking the natural pressure variations a pen creates when moving swiftly across a textured page. I recognized the specific, rigid slant of the Y and the formal, tight loop of the first letter. It was an exact replica of the signature I utilized when I was 22 years old, specifically the one I stamped onto my university financial aid applications. My mind instantly mapped the origin of the theft. When I moved out of my mother's suburban home a decade ago, I left a heavy, fireproof steel lockbox shoved into the darkest corner of my childhood closet. It contained outdated college transcripts, old tax forms, and a handful of obsolete professional supplies. Barbara still possessed the spare brass key to that bedroom. I shifted my focus to the bottom right corner of the forged deed. Resting directly beside my traced signature was a circular, blue ink stamp. It was a notary public seal, legally verifying that I had personally appeared before a commissioned officer of the state to execute the transfer of the deed. I zoomed in further until the blue pixels blurred slightly on my screen. I read the commission number and the expiration date. It was my own notary stamp. It was the very first commission stamp I had acquired at 24 years old, a piece of rubber and plastic that had officially expired 5 years ago. I had left it sitting at the bottom of that same fireproof lockbox. Trent had digitally altered the expiration date on the scanned document, changing the final digit to make it appear currently valid to a cursory county clerk. The chronological sequence of their desperate conspiracy materialized in my mind with crystal clarity. Trent had driven back to the suburbs on Thursday afternoon, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, suffocating under the reality of his impending commercial ruin. He had walked into Barbara's pristine suburban house and delivered a frantic, fabricated narrative. He likely told my mother and Vanessa that I was financially ruining myself, that I was acting erratically, and that he needed to legally secure the coastal property immediately to protect the family's assets from my supposed incompetence. Barbara, blinded by her obsession with social status, and Vanessa, blinded by her raging, unadulterated entitlement, did not ask for proof. They did not question his authority. They marched directly upstairs to my old bedroom, dragged the heavy steel lockbox from the closet, and forced the simple lock open. Barbara likely viewed breaking into her daughter's private property as her absolute maternal right. Vanessa had pressed an old university document against a glass window pane, meticulously tracing my signature onto the quitclaim deed Trent had drafted on his laptop. Trent had pressed the expired notary stamp onto the paper, scanned the document into his brokerage portal, digitally manipulated the expiration date, and submitted the fraudulent transfer to the county register of deeds via an electronic filing system. They actually believed they had outsmarted a senior estate and trust auditor using suburban arts and crafts. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves outside provided a steady, calming soundtrack to the absolute magnitude of the crime displayed on my monitor. This was no longer a matter of a greedy sister demanding the master bedroom. This was not a petty dispute over holiday catering costs or passive-aggressive social media posts. By fabricating a legal real estate document and filing it across county lines using an electronic portal, Trent had committed severe federal wire fraud, by utilizing my stolen signature to transfer an asset valued at $1.2 million. He had committed aggravated identity theft. By falsifying a state notary seal, he had committed a severe felony that carried mandatory state prison time and guaranteed the immediate, permanent revocation of his commercial real estate brokerage license. Vanessa and Barbara were no longer just toxic family members. By actively participating in the forgery and the physical theft of the documents from my childhood bedroom, they were legally defined as active co-conspirators in a massive federal property theft. My heart did not race, my palms did not sweat. A profound, chilling stillness settled over my entire body. A lesser person would have immediately dialed the local police. A frightened victim would have called Trent, screaming threats, demanding he withdraw the fraudulent filing before the deed was fully processed. If I confronted them now, Trent would panic. He would claim it was a clerical error, a misunderstanding, or a desperate attempt to protect me from myself. He would hire a high-priced defense attorney to muddy the waters, spinning a narrative of a family dispute blown wildly out of proportion. I was not going to give him the opportunity to spin a single lie. I was going to let the trap snap shut with such devastating force that no corporate lawyer in the state could pry it open. I moved my mouse and clicked the download button. I saved the high-resolution portable document format file containing the forged quitclaim deed directly into my encrypted master dossier. I then ran a secondary diagnostic script on my auditing software, extracting the hidden digital metadata embedded within the county filing. The metadata clearly displayed the Internet Protocol address from which the document had been submitted. I cross-referenced the address. It perfectly matched the commercial broadband router installed at Trent's failing brokerage firm. He had uploaded the forged deed using his own corporate network, permanently and undeniably linking his professional business license to the federal crime. I sat quietly at the granite kitchen island, drinking my black coffee. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought my silence was a symptom of defeat. They were blindly constructing a highly illegal paper trail, handing me the exact digital rope I needed to execute them all. Elias Thorne was not just a mentor. He was a brilliant legal tactician who had anticipated the vultures circling long before he passed away. I pushed my laptop back slightly, the screen still glowing with the digital footprint of my family's treason. I reached across the granite kitchen island and pulled the thick, black leather binder toward me. The heavy silver clasp felt cold against my fingertips as I snapped it open. The binder contained the physical, original documents the probate attorney had handed me 3 days ago, the actual architecture of my coastal inheritance. When the attorney had told me Elias left me a fortress, I had assumed he meant a standard irrevocable trust designed to bypass the lengthy delays of probate court. It is a common protective measure utilized by wealthy individuals to keep their assets out of the public record and away from grasping distant relatives. But as I turned the heavy, textured parchment pages of Elias's master estate plan, I realized I had severely underestimated the sheer, uncompromising brilliance of the retired federal judge. I ran my index finger down the precise, neatly typed margins of the primary deed transfer. I bypassed the standard conveyance language and turned directly to the heavily appended annexes at the back of the binder. Elias had not transferred a simple fee, simple absolute property into my name. He had meticulously restructured the entire $1.2 million estate into a highly specialized, federally protected conservation trust. I leaned closer to the documents, my eyes absorbing the dense, ironclad legal terminology. Decades ago, the coastal dunes surrounding the property had been designated as a critical environmental preservation zone, home to ancient maritime oaks and protected marine nesting grounds. Elias, utilizing his extensive federal connections, had partnered directly with a federal environmental protection agency. In exchange for massive tax subsidies during his lifetime, he had placed the land under an irrevocable conservation easement. The covenants attached to the deed were absolute and completely unforgiving. I traced the specific clauses detailing the restrictions on the property. The land could never be commercially developed. It could never be subdivided. And, most importantly, the title could never be transferred to a commercial entity, a holding company, or a limited liability corporation without the express, written authorization of a designated federal oversight committee. I stopped reading and stared at the embossed seal at the bottom of the page. The air in the kitchen felt incredibly still. If any unauthorized entity attempted to claim title to the property, or if a fraudulent encumbrance was recorded against the deed at the county level, the covenants dictated an immediate, automated response. The County Register of Deeds, bound by federal law, was required to immediately transmit a discrepancy alert to the United States Department of the Interior and the federal banking regulators. It was a legal poison pill, designed to instantly paralyze anyone attempting to seize the asset by force or fraud. My mind flashed back to the digital quitclaim deed currently resting on my laptop screen. The grantee listed on that forged document was Trent's failing commercial brokerage firm, a registered limited liability company. Trent had not just filed a forged piece of paper against his sister-in-law. By submitting that document through the county's electronic portal, he had actively attempted to seize federally protected land and transfer it into a commercial holding company. He had effectively bypassed a simple domestic dispute and marched directly into a federal jurisdiction. I pictured Elias sitting in the quiet, heavily air-conditioned conference room of my auditing firm just a year ago. I remembered the way his sharp, assessing eyes had watched me systematically untangle a messy offshore account for another client. He had tapped his gold fountain pen against the mahogany table, leaning forward slightly. He knew exactly what human nature looked like when money was involved. He knew that greed makes people blind, reckless, and incredibly stupid. He had deliberately armed the property with a tripwire so sensitive and so devastating that no local real estate broker could possibly dismantle it. I looked up from the binder and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The violent coastal storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a bruised, heavy gray sky and a churning, white-capped ocean. My pulse maintained a slow, even rhythm. If I picked up my phone right now and called the county clerk to report the forgery, the clerk would flag the transfer, halt the processing, and launch a localized investigation. Trent would receive a notification that his deed had been rejected. He would panic, hire a slick defense attorney, and spin a frantic narrative claiming it was all a terrible misunderstanding, a clerical error made by an overzealous assistant. The local authorities, bogged down by bureaucratic inefficiency, might view it as a messy family civil dispute and decline to press severe criminal charges. Trent might lose his real estate license, but he would likely avoid a lengthy prison sentence. I was not going to call the county clerk. I was not going to interrupt the automated processing of the fraudulent deed. I reached out and gently smoothed the thick parchment paper of the trust document. I decided, in that exact moment, to let the federal trap arm itself. I mapped out Trent's inevitable trajectory in my mind. The county electronic portal operates on a standard 48-hour processing delay for real estate transfers. He had submitted the forged deed on a Friday afternoon. The county system would officially record the transfer by Monday morning. The moment the county servers processed the transaction, the automated environmental covenants would detect the unauthorized commercial entity. The tripwire would snap, the federal alert would be transmitted. But Trent, completely blinded by his desperation and his towering arrogance, would not wait for the federal response. He needed immediate liquidity. He was facing a catastrophic $2.5 million balloon payment in exactly 14 days. By Tuesday morning, Trent would take his freshly stamped, forged quitclaim deed and walk directly into his commercial bank. He would sit across a polished mahogany desk from a senior loan officer. He would present the forged deed as absolute proof that he now owned a $1.2 million coastal estate, completely free and clear of any debt. He would use that stolen, federally protected land as collateral to secure a massive commercial bailout loan for his failing brokerage firm. To secure that bailout, Trent would be required to sign a sworn federal banking affidavit, legally attesting that the collateral was legitimate, unencumbered, and rightfully his. When he signed that affidavit, He would add severe federal bank fraud to his already extensive list of crimes, which included aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and the falsification of a state notary seal. He would compound his felonies, layering federal crime upon federal crime, completely oblivious to the fact that the federal regulatory agencies were already mobilizing against him. He was building his own guillotine, pulling the heavy blade higher and higher into the air with every single arrogant decision he made. My mother and my sister were equally doomed, by breaking into my childhood lockbox, tracing my signature, and physically assisting in the preparation of the fraudulent documents. They had permanently chained themselves to Trent's sinking ship, when the federal agents inevitably arrived to dismantle his fraudulent empire. Barbara's pristine country club reputation and Vanessa's unearned, entitled luxury would be instantly incinerated in the blast radius. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. For 10 years, I had absorbed their insults. I had paid their overdue bills while they mocked my career. I had endured their relentless, suffocating demands while they treated my quiet, childless life as a character defect. They had viewed my patience as a weakness. They had mistaken my professional silence for submission. I pushed the heavy leather chair back from the granite island. The air in the kitchen felt clean, crisp, and entirely free of the heavy, toxic anxiety that had followed me for my entire adult life. I had everything I needed. The digital dossier on my encrypted workstation was complete. The federal tripwires were fully engaged. All that remained was for me to sit quietly in my coastal sanctuary and watch them proudly march themselves directly into absolute ruin. I closed the heavy leather binder, allowing a cold, calculated smile to touch my lips, knowing Trent had just officially filed a forged document against a federally monitored conservation trust. Empowered by the forged deed, Trent marched directly into his commercial bank and committed a textbook violation of federal lending laws. I did not need to be sitting in the polished, mahogany-paneled office of his regional commercial bank to witness the crime. My auditing software allowed me to reconstruct his entire morning with devastating, microscopic accuracy. The county register of deeds had automatically processed the fraudulent quitclaim transfer at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. By Tuesday, at 10 in the morning, Trent's electronic footprint materialized on the bank's commercial lending portal. I envisioned him sitting across from a senior underwriter. He likely wore his best bespoke suit, projecting a manufactured aura of wealth to mask the heavy, suffocating panic of a man whose $2.5 million balloon payment was set to detonate in less than 12 days. Trent slid the county-stamped deed across the desk, radiating the absolute, unshakable confidence of a successful broker. He presented the forged document as undeniable proof that he possessed a $1.2 million coastal estate, completely free and clear of any outstanding mortgages or liens, to secure the expedited commercial line of credit he so desperately needed to stave off his impending bankruptcy. The bank required him to execute a sworn federal banking affidavit. When Trent picked up his expensive fountain pen and signed his name on that dotted line, he legally attested, under penalty of federal perjury, that the collateral was legitimate, unencumbered, and rightfully owned by his corporate entity. In that single, sweeping stroke of ink, he crossed the Rubicon. He compounded his aggravated identity theft and state-level forgery with a direct, undeniable act of severe federal bank fraud. Because the asset was massive and seemingly held no prior debt, the bank's automated underwriting algorithms fast-tracked the approval process. I sat perfectly still at my granite kitchen island, my hands resting lightly on my keyboard, watching the Uniform Commercial Code Registry refresh in real time. At precisely 1:45 in the afternoon, a new digital entry populated the screen. The bank had officially filed a commercial lien against Trent's limited liability company, listing my pristine Outer Banks sanctuary as the primary collateral. The trap was now fully, legally sealed. 15 minutes later, the financial dam broke through a secure, proprietary terminal utilized for tracking institutional clearinghouses. I watched the digital transaction execute, A massive influx of capital, exactly $2.5 million, was wired directly into Trent's primary corporate operating account. The money did not sit there for long. Within 60 seconds, the entire sum was automatically routed back out, transferred electronically to the ruthless private equity firm to satisfy his catastrophic commercial balloon payment. Trent had successfully bypassed bankruptcy, but he had done so by trading a civil financial failure for a guaranteed federal prison sentence. He had zero liquidity left. He was running a hollow, fraudulent empire held together entirely by stolen, federally protected land. The moment the wire transfer cleared, the celebration commenced. My cell phone, resting quietly beside my coffee mug, vibrated with a sharp, incoming notification. It was a video message from Vanessa. I tapped the screen, allowing the high-definition multimedia file to load. Vanessa filled the frame. She was standing in the sprawling, heavily leveraged kitchen of her suburban home. She wore a pristine designer blouse and a wide, triumphant smile that stretched perfectly across her face. Behind her, leaning casually against the marble countertop, stood Trent. He had loosened his silk tie, his posture radiating the relaxed, arrogant relief of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the entire world. Vanessa raised a crystal flute filled with sparkling, vintage champagne directly toward the camera lens. "Cheers, Amy," she sang, her voice dripping with toxic, artificial sweetness. "Trent just closed the deal. The beach house is officially under the family limited liability company where it belongs. I am already looking at new patio furniture for the wraparound deck. The kids are incredibly excited to finally have a proper summer home with enough space to breathe." Trent stepped into the frame, wrapping his arm possessively around Vanessa's waist. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes gleaming with predatory arrogance. "We told you I would handle the legalities, Amy," Trent sneered, taking a slow sip from his own champagne flute. "You really should have just taken the $50,000 buyout I offered you last week. Now you get absolutely nothing. Do not bother trying to fight this in court. You do not have the capital to match my attorneys, and your reputation is already completely ruined. Start packing your things. We expect you out by the weekend." The video ended, the screen fading to a silent black. I did not throw my phone. I did not scream at the empty kitchen walls. I did not shed a single tear for the family that was actively trying to destroy my life. Instead, I experienced a profound, chilling wave of absolute satisfaction. They were proudly documenting their own execution, packaging their criminal conspiracy into a high-definition video file, and delivering it directly to the primary auditor. They were utterly convinced that their aggressive bullying and sophisticated-sounding real estate jargon had paralyzed me with fear. I connected my phone to my encrypted workstation and transferred the video message into the master digital dossier. I placed it right next to the horrific, threatening voicemails Barbara had left earlier in the week. I then extracted the high-resolution portable document format files of the forged quitclaim deed, the altered notary stamp, and the localized internet protocol logs proving Trent had uploaded the forgery directly from his brokerage office. Finally, I downloaded the confirmed Uniform Commercial Code lien and the timestamped wire transfer receipts. I layered these documents over the original, irrevocable conservation trust covenants drafted by Elias Thorne. The paperwork painted a flawless, inescapable narrative. Trent had not just stolen a house. He had leveraged protected federal environmental land to defraud a federally insured commercial bank out of $2.5 million. I organized the files into a clean, color-coded executive summary. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the steady, measured rhythm of a surgeon closing a wound. I addressed the secure transmission to the Specific Enforcement Division of the United States Department of the Treasury, carbon copying the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I attached a brief, highly technical cover letter outlining the exact statutes of the United States Code that had been egregiously violated. I did not ask for a localized police response. I demanded a federal forensic audit. I moved my mouse over the send button. The coastal wind howled against the reinforced glass of the living room windows, completely failing to disturb the profound peace inside the house. I pressed the button. watching the progress bar flash briefly across the screen as the massive encrypted payload was securely transmitted to the highest regulatory authorities in the nation. He was toasting to his brilliance with expensive champagne, blissfully unaware that I was simultaneously routing his fraudulent loan documents directly to the United States Treasury Department. The fraudulent eviction notice arrived via certified mail, sealed in a premium envelope bearing the golden crest of Trent's failing brokerage firm. It was late Thursday morning. The coastal fog had barely burned off the Atlantic when the postal carrier climbed the wooden steps of my wraparound porch. Holding the heavy, rigid parcel, I signed the electronic clipboard, offered a polite nod, and carried the envelope back inside to the granite kitchen island. I did not tear it open with frantic, trembling hands. I retrieved a stainless steel letter opener from the drawer and sliced the top edge with one smooth, precise motion. The paper inside was incredibly thick, a heavy cotton stock designed to project wealth and unquestionable authority. Trent had spared no expense on the presentation of his lies. The document was titled, "Formal Demand for Immediate Surrender of Premises," typed in bold, aggressive lettering. I scanned the text, my eyes jumping past the dense, fabricated legal jargon to identify the core mechanism of his threat. The notice claimed that the $1.2 million coastal property was now the exclusive, legally recorded asset of his limited liability company. It demanded that I completely vacate the premises, surrender all physical keys, and remove my personal belongings within 24 hours. At the bottom of the page, Trent had signed his name in a sprawling, arrogant script, completely ignoring the fact that a commercial real estate broker possesses absolutely no legal authority to issue an eviction notice. The sheer blinding audacity of the document was almost fascinating to analyze. A legal, binding eviction requires months of municipal court filings, formal hearings, and the physical presence of a commissioned law enforcement officer. Trent had completely bypassed the judicial system. He was relying entirely on intimidation, utilizing his expensive corporate letterhead to terrify a woman he assumed was completely ignorant of the law. He fully expected me to read this letter, pack my bags in a blind panic, and flee the property before the weekend arrived. I placed the fraudulent document onto the granite countertop, smoothing the thick paper flat. It was completely worthless as a legal directive, but it was absolutely priceless as a piece of physical evidence. I retrieved a clear plastic sleeve from my briefcase, slid the eviction notice inside, and placed it directly into the master folder containing the federal wire fraud and forgery documentation I had transmitted to the Treasury Department on Tuesday. Trent was not just tying his own noose, he was actively tightening the knot. I turned my attention to the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the tide pull the gray ocean water back from the shore. The house was a fortress of profound silence, insulated entirely from the chaotic, desperate scramble my family was currently executing 3 hours away in the suburbs. I knew the silence would not last. Narcissists cannot simply issue a threat. They must actively bask in the emotional destruction they believe they have caused. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my cell phone vibrated against the polished stone counter, the screen illuminated, displaying a high-resolution photograph of my mother, Barbara, smiling perfectly at a recent country club gala. I let the phone vibrate 3 times, regulating my breathing into a slow, measured rhythm. Before I finally reached out and swiped the green icon. I did not say hello. I simply held the device to my ear and waited. "I assume you have checked your mail today, Amy." Barbara's voice echoed through the speaker. She did not sound angry. She sounded utterly victorious, her tone dripping with the condescending, manufactured sympathy of a matriarch who had just successfully crushed an unruly child. "I have," I replied, my voice a flat, unreadable hum. Barbara let out a long, theatrical sigh. "I told you not to make this difficult. I warned you that Trent would not tolerate your stubbornness. You brought this entirely on yourself. Amy, you forced his hand. He had to take immediate legal action to protect this family from your absolute selfishness." I remained entirely silent. Through the receiver, I could hear the chaotic, muffled sounds of heavy cardboard boxes being dragged across hardwood floors. Vanessa has already hired a premium moving service. Barbara continued, her voice rising with excited, unearned entitlement. They are packing the suburban house right now. The children are so incredibly thrilled to finally have a bedroom that looks out over the ocean. Vanessa has already ordered new patio furniture for the wraparound deck, and she is planning to completely remodel that outdated kitchen you have been sitting in. She needs a space suitable for hosting real family gatherings. They were actively packing their belongings. They had completely abandoned the suburban home that Trent had just cross-collateralized into oblivion, blindly marching toward a coastal estate that was currently triggering alarms at the highest levels of the federal government. The level of delusion required to measure drapes for a house you just acquired through severe federal bank fraud was staggering. Trent is being incredibly generous, all things considered, Barbara stated, her tone sharpening into a weaponized guilt trip. He could easily sue you for back rent for the days you have occupied his company's property. He could drag your name through civil court and ensure you never work in estate auditing again. But because you are blood, he is willing to let you walk away quietly. You should be down on your knees thanking him for showing you such unmerited grace. My knuckles rested lightly against the cool granite of the kitchen island. I tracked the psychological mechanics of her manipulation with the clinical detachment of a researcher studying a venomous insect. She was attempting to rewrite reality, casting the man who had just forged my signature and stolen my inheritance as a benevolent savior, while painting me as the ungrateful, burdensome spinster. Are you even listening to me, Amy? Barbara snapped, irritated by my refusal to offer her the defensive panic she craved. I am listening to every single word, I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any trembling or hesitation. Good, Barbara huffed, misinterpreting my composure for submission. Because this is not a negotiation. The moving truck is loaded. We will be driving down to the coast tomorrow morning to take full, physical possession of the property. I expect you to have your bags packed, the floors swept, and the keys resting on the kitchen counter when we arrive. We do not want to endure a dramatic, tearful scene in front of the children. Do not make this harder than it has to be. She waited for a response. She waited for me to break, to apologize, to beg for a few more days to gather my belongings. She wanted the auditory confirmation of my complete surrender. I looked across the kitchen, my eyes locking onto the heavy, black leather binder Elias Thorne had left me, sitting undisturbed on the far counter. Come at 10 in the morning, I replied. I did not wait for her to gloat. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red icon. Severing the connection instantly, the profound, heavy silence of the beach house immediately rushed back in, swallowing the toxic echoes of her voice. I walked slowly across the wide plank hardwood floors toward the far counter. I unclasped the heavy silver lock of the black leather binder and turned the thick parchment pages until I reached the final annex at the very back. Tucked securely into a clear archival sleeve was a single, sealed envelope. Elias Thorne had drafted this specific letter months before his passing, anticipating the exact brand of greed my family was currently exhibiting. He had instructed the probate attorney to place it in the binder, to be utilized only if the federal tripwires he had painstakingly engineered were actively triggered. I slid the envelope out of the protective sleeve. The paper was crisp, bearing the embossed seal of a retired federal judge. It was not a document designed to negotiate or intimidate. It was a document designed to legally and completely obliterate the reader. I hung up the phone, placed the single, devastating letter from Elias Thorne on the kitchen counter, and prepared the house for an execution. The morning sun was reflecting brilliantly off the ocean when the obnoxious roar of a commercial moving truck shattered the coastal serenity. It was exactly 10 o'clock on Friday morning. I stood motionless on the top step of the wraparound cedar porch, the cool coastal breeze pulling lightly at the hem of my navy trousers. I held the sealed envelope bearing Elias Thorne's embossed seal lightly between my thumb and index finger. I had not swept the hardwood floors. I had not packed a single cardboard box. I had not summoned a moving vehicle of my own. I simply stood in the shadow of the porch overhang and waited for the execution to commence. The massive white moving truck aggressively navigated the narrow gravel driveway, its heavy dual tires crushing the white seashells and snapping the low-hanging branches of the ancient maritime oaks that lined the property. It parked at a severe, thoughtless angle, its diesel engine rumbling loudly before cutting off with a violent, metallic shudder. Right behind it, gleaming under the bright Atlantic sun, the familiar silver luxury SUV came to an abrupt, jerky halt. The doors of the SUV swung open in unison. Vanessa stepped out first, her oversized designer sunglasses completely shielding her eyes. She clutched a large iced coffee in one hand and slung an expensive leather tote bag over her shoulder. She wore a brightly colored silk blouse and pristine white jeans, an outfit entirely impractical for the grueling labor of moving, visually broadcasting that she had absolutely no intention of lifting a single box. Barbara emerged from the rear passenger seat, clutching a clipboard and a silver pen, instantly adopting the posture of a general commanding a battlefield. She began barking sharp, staccato orders at the two hired movers who were stepping down from the cab of the truck. Then, Trent exited the driver's side. He wore a crisp, light blue linen blazer over a dark polo shirt, projecting the absolute picture of casual, unbothered wealth. He adjusted his collar, inhaled a deep, theatrical breath of the salty ocean air, and stretched his arms wide. He surveyed the expansive $1.2 million estate with the sickeningly arrogant posture of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world. The slight, high-frequency tremor in his hands, the nervous cold sweat that had coated his hairline just 1 week prior, had completely vanished. The $2.5 million federal bailout loan currently sitting in his corporate operating account had temporarily erased his terror, replacing it with a towering, blinding hubris. Be careful with those boxes!" Vanessa shrieked at the movers, pointing her manicured finger toward the back of the heavy truck. "The antique dining set goes directly into the main living room, and do not scuff the hardwood floors." She turned her attention to the massive exterior of the cedar-clad house, her eyes scanning the second-story windows with aggressive hunger. "The boys will take the 2 rooms on the left," she declared loudly, intentionally ensuring her voice carried over the sound of the crashing waves to reach me on the porch. "Trent and I will obviously take the master suite facing the water. The nursery can go in that smaller room near the stairs." Barbara nodded approvingly, clicking her silver pen and checking a box on her clipboard. "It is absolutely perfect, Vanessa, finally. A proper, growing family will breathe some actual life into this property. It is an absolute tragedy that it sat empty for so long, acting as a lonely retreat for a single woman with absolutely no legacy to leave behind. They treated my presence on the porch as a minor, pathetic inconvenience. They did not immediately look in my direction. They performed a theatrical, highly choreographed display of ownership, claiming the physical space with their loud voices and expansive gestures. The 2 hired movers stood awkwardly by the tailgate of the truck, glancing nervously between the shouting women and my silent figure on the porch, sensing the toxic hostility radiating across the driveway. Trent walked around the front of the silver SUV, casually jingling his brass keys in his hand. He looked up at the wooden balcony, pointing out the weathered cedar shingles to Vanessa. "We will need to have the exterior power washed by next week," Trent instructed smoothly, acting the part of the seasoned real estate magnate. "And I want to expand that lower deck. My firm can easily write off the renovations as a corporate hospitality expense. I have a few commercial developers I want to entertain out here next month." Finally, after they had sufficiently performed their dominance for the benefit of the hired movers, Trent turned his attention to me. He placed his hands firmly on his hips, his linen blazer pulling tightly across his shoulders. His eyes swept over my unbothered posture, noting the glaring lack of moving boxes and the single piece of paper resting in my hand. His smug smile widened into a condescending, predatory smirk. "Still here, Amy?" Trent called out, his voice echoing harshly across the gravel driveway. "I thought my eviction notice was explicitly clear. You were supposed to be packed, cleaned, and gone by 10 o'clock this morning. I sincerely hope you are not planning to throw a dramatic tantrum, Because I really do not have the patience for it today. Vanessa walked up beside her husband, resting her hand on his arm, her massive diamond ring flashing brightly in the morning sun. She lowered her sunglasses slightly, peering at me over the designer frames with absolute disdain. Do not tell me you are actually trying to hold this up. Amy. Vanessa sighed, her tone dripping with exasperation. You look completely pathetic standing there. We brought movers. The house is ours. Trent filed the paperwork. And the deed is securely in his company's name. You have absolutely no legal standing here. Just hand over the brass keys and walk away with whatever shred of dignity you have left. Barbara stepped forward, adopting her familiar, weaponized maternal tone designed to induce immediate compliance. Amy, do not embarrass yourself in front of the hired help, she scolded, gesturing dismissively toward the two men unloading heavy cardboard boxes from the back of the truck. We are willing to let you pack your clothes and leave quietly. Trent is being generous enough not to charge you for the time you spent trespassing on his property. Just be a sensible adult for once in your life. You do not have children. You do not need a 5-bedroom coastal estate. Stop acting like a spoiled, selfish child and step aside so your sister can finally move her family into their rightful home. I did not raise my voice. I did not shift my weight. I maintained the cold, analytical stillness of an auditor watching a fraudulent ledger permanently balance itself out. I looked at Trent, the desperate commercial broker who had leveraged federally protected land to secure an illegal bailout. I looked at Vanessa, the greedy sister who had traced my signature onto a forged document just to secure a master bedroom. I looked at Barbara, the narcissistic mother who had orchestrated a public smear campaign to destroy my professional reputation. The ocean wind whipped around us, snapping the fabric of Trent's linen blazer and rustling the thick canopy of the maritime oaks. They waited for my response. They waited for the tears, the frantic apologies, or the desperate pleading they had grown so accustomed to extracting from me over the past decade. When I offered them absolutely nothing but a cold, dead stare, the smugness on Trent's face faltered for a microscopic fraction of a second. He did not understand my silence. He expected a terrified spinster, crushed under the weight of his fabricated legal threats and the sheer physical presence of a moving truck. He covered his sudden, creeping unease with aggressive, forward action. He marched toward the wooden stairs, his expensive leather shoes crunching loudly against the crushed seashells. Vanessa and Barbara followed closely behind him, forming a unified front of unearned entitlement and staggering arrogance. They strutted up the wooden steps with the unearned confidence of conquering royalty, completely unaware they were marching directly onto a federal landmine. I stood perfectly still on the wraparound porch, offering absolutely no tears, no apologies, and no keys. Trent reached the top landing first. He stopped just inches from my face, intentionally violating my personal space to establish physical dominance. He smelled of expensive cologne and the bitter, metallic tang of unearned adrenaline. Behind him, Vanessa tapped her designer's shoe against the wooden deck, sighing heavily, while Barbara gripped her clipboard, her knuckles turning white with impatient irritation. We are done playing games. Amy, Trent stated, holding his right hand out, palm up, expectant and demanding. I filed the paperwork. The deed is officially in my limited liability company's name. I secured the property, handled the taxes, and gave you a generous window to vacate. Now, hand over the brass keys and get off my property. I did not reach into my pocket. I did not step aside. I looked down at his outstretched hand, then back up to his eyes. You did not file standard paperwork, Trent, I replied, my voice a quiet, flat hum that barely competed with the crashing waves. You broke into my childhood lockbox. You forced your wife to trace my signature onto a fraudulent quitclaim deed, and you digitally altered an expired notary stamp. Then, you uploaded that forgery across county lines using your commercial brokerage firm's internet protocol address. The confident, patronizing smirk on Trent's face froze. His outstretched hand twitched, for a microscopic second. The sheer terror of hearing his precise criminal methodology recited back to him pierced his arrogant facade. But his ego, heavily inflated by the $2.5 million bailout loan currently resting in his bank account, quickly rushed in to repair the breach. He scoffed, dropping his hand and shaking his head. "You are completely delusional," Trent laughed, looking back at Vanessa and Barbara as if sharing a bizarre joke. "Listen to her. She is losing her mind over a simple real estate transaction. Nobody forged anything. You signed it. You stamped it. And now, you are having seller's remorse. Good luck proving otherwise in a civil court with zero capital to hire a decent attorney." "Give us the keys right now, Amy," Vanessa snapped, stepping around her husband and shoving her hand directly into my chest space. "I am not standing out here in this wind negotiating with a jealous spinster. The movers are charging by the hour. Give me the keys." I slowly raised my right hand. I did not hold the heavy brass ring. I held the crisp, sealed envelope. Vanessa snatched it from my fingers with a violent, impatient jerk. She glared at the thick paper, expecting a handwritten apology or a pathetic plea for a few more days. Instead, she found a heavy, rigid document bearing a raised, metallic blind seal stamped directly into the paper. "What is this?" Vanessa hissed, dragging her manicured thumb across the embossed seal. "What kind of dramatic nonsense is this?" "That is the deed," I stated softly. "Or, more accurately, that is the ironclad legal framework attached to the deed you just tried to steal." Barbara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at the heavy parchment. "Just open it. Vanessa, she is just trying to stall. Tear it up and let the movers inside." Vanessa slid her long acrylic nail under the flap, ripping the envelope open with a jagged, aggressive motion. She pulled out a single sheet of heavy cotton paper. The document was not drafted on standard legal letterhead. It bore the unmistakable, terrifying crest of the United States federal court system. Vanessa's eyes darted to the top of the page. She read the name printed in bold, black ink. Elias Thorne, Senior Judge, United States District Court. I watched the exact moment her reality began to fracture. The vibrant, triumphant flush on her cheeks rapidly faded into a sickly, chalky white. Her chest, which had been rising and falling with arrogant indignation, suddenly locked. She forgot to breathe. Her eyes darted wildly across the first paragraph, tracking the dense, uncompromising legal terminology. Her hands, weighed down by the massive diamond ring Trent had purchased with stolen leverage, began to shake. The tremor started in her fingertips and quickly traveled up her wrists, causing the heavy paper to rattle loudly in the coastal breeze. "Vanessa?" Trent asked, his tone dropping the casual amusement. He stepped closer, noticing the sudden, violent physiological shift in his wife. "Vanessa, what does it say? Stop playing around." Vanessa did not answer him. She could not force her vocal cords to function. She stared at the paper as if it were a live explosive device. I remained entirely still, allowing the silence to stretch and suffocate them. "Elias Thorne did not just transfer a $1.2 million fee simple absolute property into my name," I explained, my voice slicing through the heavy, salted air. "He placed this entire coastal estate into a federally protected conservation trust, overseen directly by the Department of the Interior. The covenants attached to the deed explicitly prohibit the transfer of this land to any commercial entity. Any attempt to record a commercial line against this parcel triggers an immediate, automated discrepancy alert to federal banking regulators." Trent's posture collapsed. The perfectly tailored shoulders of his light blue linen blazer sagged. He lunged forward, snatching the heavy parchment paper out of Vanessa's trembling hands. His eyes locked onto the text. He was a commercial real estate broker. He understood the terminology perfectly. He read the clauses outlining the irrevocable conservation easement. He read the specific federal statutes Elias Thorne had weaponized to protect the land. He read the automated audit triggers. The high-frequency tremor in his hands, the one he had tried so desperately to hide in my kitchen a week ago, returned with catastrophic violence. The paper shook so hard in his grip it threatened to tear. The cold sweat erupted across his forehead, gleaming under the bright Atlantic sun. He realized the true magnitude of his error. He had not just bullied a quiet, childless accountant, he had forged a federal document. He had walked into a federally insured commercial bank and signed a sworn banking affidavit pledging protected federal land as collateral to secure a $2.5 million commercial bailout loan. He had committed massive, undeniable federal bank fraud. And the automated tripwires Elias Thorne had engineered meant the federal government had known about the crime the exact second the commercial loan was approved. "No," Trent wheezed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate gasp. "No, this is wrong. The county clerk approved the transfer. The bank underwriter cleared the title. They wired the funds. They wired $2.5 million yesterday." The bank underwriter cleared a forged document because they rely on sworn affidavits. "Trent," I replied, staring directly into his wide, panicked eyes. "You swore under penalty of federal perjury that the collateral was clean. You bypassed the manual title review to secure an expedited bridge loan because you were terrified of missing your massive balloon payment. You handed them the rope, and they let you hang yourself with it." Barbara finally realized the severity of the situation. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden deck. "Trent, what is she talking about?" Barbara shrieked, her country club poise entirely shattered. "What federal trust? You said you filed the paperwork. You said this was a simple transfer." Trent could not answer her. He backed away from me, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked at the heavy white moving truck parked in the driveway, then at the silver luxury SUV, realizing that everything he owned was completely built on a foundation of radioactive federal fraud. The illusion of his generational wealth, the bespoke suits, the unearned arrogance, it was all disintegrating before his very eyes. Vanessa stood frozen, staring at the paper in Trent's shaking hands. The unearned confidence, the vicious entitlement, the cruel mockery of my childless life, it all evaporated, completely annihilated by the heavy cotton paper drafted by a dead federal judge. She opened her mouth, her lips parting as she forced herself to read the final words aloud, her reality collapsing with every single syllable. "If you are reading this," Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling violently, "you have successfully committed federal property fraud against the United States government." Trent staggered backward, clutching his chest as the mathematical impossibility of his survival finally crashed down upon his towering ego. The expensive, light blue linen blazer he had worn like a suit of armor suddenly looked heavy and suffocating. He bumped hard against the wooden railing of the porch, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the damp cedar planks. He ripped the heavy parchment paper from Vanessa's trembling hands, his bloodshot eyes scanning the dense federal terminology one more time, desperately searching for a loophole, a typo, a misunderstanding. He found nothing but the absolute certainty of a federal indictment. Vanessa backed away from him, her oversized designer sunglasses sliding down the bridge of her nose. The arrogant, entitled matriarch who had just loudly claimed the master suite was entirely gone. She stared at her husband with wide, terrified eyes, her shallow breaths hitching in her throat. "Trent?" Barbara demanded, her voice cracking as she abandoned her clipboard on the deck. The plastic shattered against the wood, sending her moving checklists scattering across the porch. "Trent, what did you do? You told us this was a standard transfer. You told us she was mentally unfit and that you were simply securing the asset for the family trust." Trent did not look at his mother-in-law. He did not look at his wife. He stared exclusively at me. The condescending smirk he had worn since he stepped out of his luxury silver SUV had completely dissolved, replaced by a mask of raw, visceral terror. He fell forward onto his knees, the harsh impact echoing loudly over the crashing waves of the Atlantic. He reached his hands through the wooden railing, gripping the cedar spindles so tightly his knuckles turned a stark bone white. "Amy, listen to me," Trent gasped, his chest heaving violently as he struggled to pull oxygen into his restricted lungs. "We can fix this. I can stop it. I will call the county clerk right now. I will tell them to void the transfer. I will reverse the quitclaim deed today. I will write you a check for $100,000 right here on this porch. Just call whoever you need to call and tell them it was a misunderstanding between siblings. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting loosely at my sides. I observed the heavy beads of cold sweat rolling down his forehead, stinging his eyes. I watched a man who had threatened me with total bankruptcy in my own kitchen just a week prior now groveling on the floor like a terrified animal. You cannot reverse a wire transfer that has already satisfied a mezzanine debt. Trent, I explained, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal precision. You cannot simply hit undo on a $2.5 million commercial bailout loan. Trent's jaw dropped. The breath caught in his throat with a sharp, wheezing hiss. He stared at me, his pupils dilating in pure shock as his brain tried to comprehend how I knew the exact, classified figures of his private commercial financing. He had assumed I was a passive, technologically illiterate spinster who spent her days organizing file cabinets. He had completely failed to realize he was attempting to defraud a senior estate and trust auditor who spent her entire career dismantling the hidden offshore ledgers of corrupt billionaires. The moment you walked into that commercial bank and signed a sworn federal affidavit pledging this federally protected conservation trust as collateral, the trap snapped shut. I continued, my tone entirely devoid of sympathy. When the bank underwriter approved your fraudulent loan and wired $2.5 million into your corporate operating account, the automated Federal Clearinghouse recorded the transaction. The audit was triggered instantly. It is mathematically impossible to stop. You knew, Vanessa shrieked, the reality of the situation finally penetrating her blinding entitlement. She turned her fury away from me and aimed it directly at her husband. You knew you were drowning. You lied to me, Trent. You told me business was booming. You told me tracing her signature was just a legal formality because she was too stubborn to sign the papers. The facade of their perfect, wealthy marriage disintegrated right there on the wraparound porch. Trent snapped his head toward Vanessa, his face twisting into a vicious, cornered snarl. Shut your mouth, Vanessa. Trent roared, spit flying from his lips as he threw his own wife directly under the federal bus. You traced the signature? You and your mother broke into her childhood lockbox. You stole the expired notary stamp. I did not physically forge the document. You did. We are in this together. And if I go to a federal penitentiary, you are going right into the cell next to me. Barbara gasped, clutching her heavy leather handbag against her chest as if it could physically shield her from the incoming legal fallout. The wealthy, status-obsessed suburban socialite finally realized the gravity of her actions. She had not just gossiped at the country club. By actively participating in the theft of my documents, she was officially a co-conspirator in a massive federal property crime. Her pristine reputation, her social standing, her entire identity was about to be incinerated. Amy, you have to make this stop, Barbara pleaded. Tears of pure self-pity streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. You are destroying this family. We are your blood. You cannot send your own sister to prison. I did not force Vanessa to trace my signature onto a forged document. I replied softly, my gaze shifting to my mother. I did not digitally alter a state notary seal that expired 5 years ago. I did not log onto a commercial broadband router and transmit a fraudulent deed across county lines. You destroyed yourselves. I simply stepped out of the way and allowed you to fall. The two hired movers, who had been quietly standing by the tailgate of the massive white moving truck, suddenly realized they had just been contracted to assist in an active federal crime scene. They did not ask for their hourly wages. They did not say a single word. They silently closed the heavy metal doors of their truck, backed away from the staircase, and walked briskly down the gravel driveway, abandoning the vehicle entirely. Trent watched the movers leave, his isolation becoming absolute. He crawled forward on the porch, ignoring the splinters catching the expensive fabric of his trousers. He reached his hand out, desperately trying to grab the hem of my navy slacks. I took a single, deliberate step backward, refusing to let him touch me. Please, Amy, Trent sobbed, the tears mixing with the heavy sweat pouring down his face. "I will call the bank. I will tell them I made a clerical error. I will surrender my brokerage license. Just please do not let them audit the accounts." The automated audit was merely the first tripwire. "Trent," I stated, delivering the final, devastating blow with absolute, unyielding calm. "I did not just sit in this house and wait for the federal government to notice your forgery. I spent the last week tracking your toxic debt. I pulled the Uniform Commercial Code filings. I tracked the mechanics liens filed by the unpaid contractors on your failing commercial strip mall. I extracted the Internet Protocol logs proving you uploaded the forged deed from your office network." Trent's eyes rolled back slightly, the magnitude of his complete exposure crushing the last remnants of his sanity. "I compiled a massive, encrypted digital dossier containing the high-resolution portable document format files of your forgery, alongside the time-stamped wire transfer receipts of your illegal bailout," I concluded, looking down at his pathetic, shivering frame. "I sent the entire payload directly to the Enforcement Division of the United States Department of the Treasury on Tuesday afternoon." Trent dropped his face into his hands, letting out a hollow, agonizing wail that was completely swallowed by the sound of the crashing Atlantic waves. He was entirely bankrupt. His career was permanently obliterated. His freedom was officially over. He was a dead man breathing coastal air. Before Trent could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse, the deafening screech of tires echoing down the gravel driveway sealed his fate forever. The heavy doors of the federal vehicles swung open, unleashing a highly coordinated tactical team onto my pristine lawn. 3 massive, unmarked black SUVs formed a harsh, impenetrable barricade across the crushed white seashells of my driveway. They parked with aggressive, calculated precision, completely boxing in the silver luxury SUV and the abandoned commercial moving truck. The coastal dust kicked up by their screeching tires drifted like smoke over the dune grasses, catching the bright morning sunlight. The synchronized, heavy slamming of reinforced car doors echoed like gunfire over the crashing Atlantic waves. More than a dozen men and women stepped out into the coastal air. They did not wear bespoke linen blazers or flash designer watches. They wore dark navy windbreakers emblazoned with the bold, bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by officers displaying the distinct badges of the United States Department of the Treasury. They moved with terrifying, silent efficiency. There was no shouting. There was no chaotic scrambling. They spread out, establishing a secure perimeter around the property in a matter of seconds. 2 agents marched directly toward the abandoned moving truck, checking the cab and securing the rear doors. 4 more agents took up positions along the gravel driveway, their hands resting firmly on their tactical belts. On the porch, the remaining oxygen evaporated from Trent's lungs, the man who had strutted up my wooden steps just 20 minutes prior, loudly claiming the master bedroom and demanding my brass keys, was now physically melting into the cedar decking. His knees remained glued to the floorboards, his hands, still clutching the wooden spindles of the railing, shook with such violent force that his entire body vibrated. He stared at the federal agents swarming the lawn, his eyes wide and unblinking, his jaw hanging slack. Vanessa pressed her back flat against the cedar siding of the house. Her pristine white jeans were forgotten. Her oversized designer sunglasses slid down her face, revealing eyes wide with pure, unadulterated panic. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to physically shrink herself into the shadows of the porch overhang. Barbara remained frozen near the shattered remains of her plastic clipboard, her manicured hands covering her mouth, her chest heaving in rapid, terrified gasps. A tall, broad-shouldered federal agent separated himself from the tactical perimeter and walked deliberately toward the wooden staircase. He carried a thick, heavily sealed manila folder in his left hand. He did not rush. His black tactical boots crunched against the seashells, transitioning to the heavy, hollow thud of rubber against cedar as he ascended the steps. He reached the top landing and stopped exactly where Trent had stood when he demanded my eviction. The agent did not look at me. He did not look at Vanessa or Barbara. He looked down at the pathetic, sweating broker cowering on the floor. "Trenton," the agent stated. his voice a deep, resonant baritone that offered absolutely no room for negotiation. He did not ask a question, he established a fact. Trent swallowed hard. An audible, dry click in the back of his throat. He forced his hands to let go of the wooden spindles. He tried to push himself up off the deck, attempting to salvage a fraction of his corporate dignity, but his legs refused to hold his weight. He managed to rise to a half-crouch, leaning heavily against the railing for physical support. "There has been a massive misunderstanding," Trent croaked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "I am a licensed commercial real estate broker. This is a private family civil dispute regarding a shared coastal inheritance. My mother-in-law can verify everything. You do not need to be here. We are handling it internally." The federal agent did not flinch. He did not entertain the frantic, fabricated narrative. He simply raised the thick manila folder and flipped it open. "We are not here to mediate a civil dispute," the agent replied, his tone as cold and unyielding as a steel vault. "We are here to execute a federal arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court." The agent extracted a heavy stack of paper from the folder. The top document bore the unmistakable seal of a federal magistrate. Underneath it was a flawless, high-resolution color copy of the forged quitclaim deed I had transmitted to the Treasury Department just days ago. At 9 o'clock on Monday morning, a quitclaim deed was electronically filed across county lines, transferring a $1.2 million coastal estate into your commercial limited liability company, the agent recited. His eyes locked onto Trent's pale, sweating face. "Our cyber division traced the Internet protocol address of that specific upload directly to the broadband router installed at your primary commercial brokerage firm." Trent opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps throw Vanessa under the bus again, but the agent cut him off effortlessly. "At 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, you walked into a federally insured commercial bank," the agent continued, pulling a second document from the folder, a copy of the sworn banking affidavit. "You presented that forged deed as unencumbered collateral. You signed a federal banking affidavit, swearing under penalty of perjury that the property was legally yours. You used that fraudulent collateral to secure a $2.5 million commercial loan, which you immediately wired to a private equity firm to satisfy a delinquent balloon payment." The sheer surgical precision of the agent's recitation completely paralyzed Trent. The federal government had completely mapped his entire criminal architecture. They knew exactly how much money he had stolen, where he had hidden it, and exactly how he had manipulated the system to get it. "That property is held in an irrevocable, federally protected conservation trust overseen by the Department of the Interior," the agent stated, delivering the final, crushing blow. "By forging a signature and an expired notary stamp to leverage protected federal land, you did not just defraud a bank. You committed a severe federal offense against the United States government." Trent's last remaining shred of defiance evaporated. The bespoke Italian suit, the luxury silver SUV, the unearned arrogance, it all dissolved into the salty coastal air, leaving nothing but a desperate, cornered criminal. He looked wildly at Vanessa, silently begging his wife to intervene, to scream, to offer him any kind of lifeline. Vanessa just squeezed her eyes shut and turned her face toward the cedar siding, entirely abandoning him to the consequences of their shared greed. "I did not know," Trent sobbed, the tears finally spilling over his eyelashes, cutting clear tracks through the heavy sweat on his cheeks. "My wife traced the signature. I did not know the land was protected. Please, you have to let me call my corporate attorney. I can reverse the wire transfer. I can give the money back. Just let me make a phone call." "You do not possess $2.5 million to give back," the agent countered smoothly, signaling to the two tactical officers waiting at the bottom of the steps. "The Treasury Department officially froze every single operating account associated with your brokerage firm at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. You are entirely bankrupt." The two tactical officers ascended the wooden stairs with heavy, synchronized steps. They did not hesitate. They did not offer Trent the opportunity to surrender peacefully. They moved in with professional, overwhelming physical force. They grabbed Trent by his upper arms, hauling his trembling, dead weight off the cedar deck. He let out a loud, pathetic wail, his legs dragging uselessly against the wood as they spun him around and slammed his chest forcefully against the porch railing. "Trenton," the lead agent announced, his voice projecting clearly over the sound of Trent's hysterical sobbing. "You are under arrest for aggravated identity theft, severe wire fraud, and making false statements to a federally insured financial institution." Trent thrashed weakly against the railing, his face contorted in pure, unadulterated agony as he watched his entire life permanently disintegrate. The officers pinned his arms firmly behind his back, easily overpowering his pathetic resistance. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting around Trent's wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. Vanessa shrieked as a female federal agent calmly explained that the luxury SUV she arrived in was now officially property of the United States Treasury. The agent, a woman with closely cropped hair and a heavy tactical vest, stood directly in front of my sister, completely unbothered by the hysterical, high-pitched vocal assault. Trent was currently being marched down the wooden stairs, his polished leather shoes dragging against the cedar steps as the two tactical officers hauled his dead weight toward the waiting black vehicles. Vanessa watched her husband disappear, her mouth open in a perfect circle of shock, before snapping her attention back to the female agent standing on the porch. "You cannot take my car!" Vanessa screamed, her hands clutching the expensive leather tote bag so tightly her knuckles mirrored the bone-white color of her pristine jeans. "My children's car seats are in there. Trent bought that for me for our anniversary. It has absolutely nothing to do with his commercial real estate business. You have absolutely no right to touch my personal property." The federal agent did not raise her voice. She reached into her dark navy windbreaker and produced a thick, laminated asset manifest. "The vehicle in question is registered to your husband's primary limited liability company," the agent recited, her eyes scanning the document with clinical detachment. "The exact same limited liability company that fraudulently received $2.5 million in illicit commercial bailout funds yesterday afternoon. Furthermore, forensic accounting indicates that the capital used to purchase this vehicle was secured by cross-collateralizing the secondary residential mortgage on your suburban home." Vanessa blinked rapidly, her brain struggling to process the dense financial terminology. She looked at me, desperate for a translation, but I offered her nothing but a cold, unwavering stare. "Your husband pledged your family home to secure a failing commercial loan, Vanessa," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the salty coastal air. "When that commercial loan failed, he utilized the remaining equity to purchase your luxury car. Every single item you own, from the massive diamond ring on your finger to the silver SUV parked in my driveway, was purchased with stolen, leveraged capital. Because he defaulted on the original covenants, the federal government is now reclaiming the proceeds of his bank fraud. Your suburban house is currently in active foreclosure. You do not own a home. You do not own a car. You are entirely bankrupt." Vanessa's jaw dropped open. She looked at the massive white moving truck parked in the driveway. Suddenly realizing the horrific truth, the cardboard boxes packed inside that truck contained the absolute last remnants of her entire life, and she currently possessed absolutely nowhere to unload them. The unearned luxury she had weaponized against me for a decade evaporated in a matter of seconds. "Hand over the keys, ma'am," the female agent commanded, extending an open, gloved palm. Vanessa shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair whipping wildly across her face in the ocean wind. She took a stumbling step backward, pressing herself hard against the cedar siding of the house. "No, this is a terrible mistake," Vanessa sobbed, the arrogant entitlement completely replaced by a pathetic, desperate panic. "I am just a mother. I am a housewife. I do not know anything about his business accounts. I did not trace the signature on that deed. Trent made me do it. He told me Amy was losing her mind and that it was a legal necessity to protect the family trust." The lead federal agent, who had just finished coordinating Trent's placement into the back of an unmarked vehicle, turned his attention back to the porch. He walked slowly up the wooden steps, pulling a clear plastic evidence bag from his pocket. Inside the bag was a printed digital transcript. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense when we possess the digital text messages confirming your active, enthusiastic participation, the lead agent stated. His voice a deep, resonant rumble that shook the wooden floorboards. At 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, you sent a text message to your husband stating, and I quote, "I got the old signature from the lockbox. It looks perfect. Make sure you get the eviction notice printed so we can kick her out by Friday." End quote. Vanessa's jaw clamped shut. The oxygen seemed to vanish entirely from her lungs. The federal government had not just audited Trent's bank accounts, they had subpoenaed their cellular provider. Every arrogant, cruel message they had exchanged while plotting my ruin was now officially catalogued as federal evidence. "You are not a naive bystander," the agent continued, his eyes locking onto her terrified face. "You physically fabricated a federal document. You conspired to defraud a federally insured institution. Give the agent your keys and place your hands behind your back." Vanessa dropped her expensive leather tote bag. It hit the cedar deck with a dull, heavy thud, spilling a designer wallet and a cluster of silver keys across the wooden planks. She did not fight as the female agent spun her around and secured her wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. She wept, a loud, ugly, visceral sobbing, mourning the immediate, permanent loss of her unearned status. With Trent and Vanessa neutralized, the federal agents turned their collective, unyielding focus toward the final architect of the conspiracy. Barbara had spent the last 10 minutes attempting to silently inch her way toward the far edge of the wraparound porch, hoping to slip unnoticed down the side stairs and escape into the tall coastal dune grasses. When the lead agent turned his piercing gaze toward her, she froze instantly. Her expensive, tailored blazer suddenly looked ridiculous against her pale, shaking frame. She clutched her ruined plastic clipboard against her chest, attempting to project the aristocratic, untouchable aura she so frequently weaponized at her country club luncheons. "Officers, I assure you, this situation has absolutely nothing to do with me," Barbara announced, her voice trembling but artificially elevated, as if she were addressing an incompetent waiter at a charity gala. "I am a highly respected member of the community. I sit on the board of 3 local charities. I simply drove down here today to help my daughter move her furniture. I have zero involvement in my son-in-law's commercial business practices." The lead agent did not blink. He stepped directly into her personal space, completely immune to her suburban matriarch facade. "We are well aware of your social standing, Barbara," the agent replied, his tone laced with absolute, clinical disdain. "We are also well aware that you personally provided the spare brass key to the locked bedroom where the forged documents were physically stored. We possess the text messages proving you coordinated the timeline of the forgery while simultaneously orchestrating a targeted public harassment campaign to force the victim into rapid compliance." Barbara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate realization: the toxic voicemails, the aggressive social media posts, the relentless pressure campaign she had proudly executed to break my spirit was now officially classified as federal witness, tampering, and coercion. "You are actively implicated as a co-conspirator in a severe federal property theft," the agent stated, his voice carrying over the crashing Atlantic waves, ensuring every single tactical officer on the property heard the charges. "As part of our investigation into the coercion charges, federal agents have spent the entire morning conducting interviews with your associates. We have spoken with the president of your country club, the head of your church congregation, and several extended family members to legally verify the defamatory statements you published online." "You spoke to them?" Barbara shrieked, the pristine, controlled mask of the wealthy socialite shattering into a million jagged pieces. "You sent federal agents to my country club. You cannot do that. My friends will see the federal notices. You will completely destroy my reputation." "Your reputation is the absolute least of your concerns right now," the agent corrected her smoothly, Federal banking regulators have already initiated a comprehensive audit of your personal checking accounts to determine if any of the illicit $2.5 million bailout funds were transferred to you to cover your daughter's personal debts. You are facing decades in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy to commit bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. Barbara's eyes rolled back slightly. The mathematical impossibility of talking her way out of a federal indictment finally crushed her towering ego. She realized, in that exact, horrifying second, that her entire life was permanently over. The women at the country club, the church congregation she had weaponized against me, the wealthy neighbors she desperately tried to impress, they were all going to watch her get dragged across the regional news channels in a pair of steel handcuffs. She would not be remembered as a wealthy, devoted grandmother. She would be remembered as a vicious, common criminal who had broken into her own daughter's childhood bedroom to steal an inheritance. The social exile she had so gleefully threatened me with was now her absolute, permanent reality. Barbara collapsed onto the wooden porch, weeping not for her daughter's impending prison sentence, but for the utter, irrecoverable destruction of her precious country club reputation. The spectacular implosion of Trent's fraudulent real estate empire dominated the regional financial news cycles for the next 3 weeks. Local broadcast stations and coastal newspapers prominently displayed the mugshot of the arrogant commercial broker who had attempted to leverage federally protected land to cover his toxic debts. I sat quietly at my granite kitchen island, drinking my black coffee, watching a reporter stand outside the sealed glass doors of Trent's former commercial brokerage firm. The golden crest on the brick exterior had been unceremoniously covered by heavy white federal seizure notices, their edges fluttering violently in the autumn wind. The swiftness of the judicial response was breathtaking. Because Trent had executed a severe federal bank fraud involving $2.5 million and had demonstrated a clear willingness to fabricate legal documents across county lines, the federal magistrate designated him a severe flight risk. During his preliminary arraignment, his high-priced defense attorney attempted to argue for house arrest, citing Trent's supposedly deep ties to the community. The judge did not even look up from the high-resolution copy of the forged quitclaim deed before slamming the wooden gavel against the sound block, denying bail entirely. Trent was remanded directly to a high-security federal holding facility. I watched the brief courtroom footage on the evening broadcast. The man who had worn bespoke Italian linen blazers and flashed luxury watches just a month prior was now shuffling into the courtroom wearing a standard issue, shapeless orange federal jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains. He kept his head bowed, his face pale and gaunt, completely stripped of the unearned, predatory condescension he had weaponized in my kitchen. The state real estate licensing board did not wait for a criminal conviction. They convened an emergency disciplinary hearing and permanently revoked his commercial broker's license within 48 hours of his arrest. His career was utterly annihilated. He sat in a concrete cell while federal forensic accountants methodically dismantled his entire financial existence. The private equity firm that had provided his $2.5 million bridge loan immediately triggered their cross-default clauses. They seized the failing commercial strip mall, liquidating the asset at a massive loss just to recoup a fraction of their capital. The civil courts subsequently unfroze Trent's remaining corporate accounts just long enough to distribute the last scraps of liquidity to the independent contractors he had stiffed for months. The roofing companies and commercial plumbers finally received their $420,000 in unpaid invoices. Every single corporate holding company Trent had spun up to project his false wealth was systematically dissolved. The federal government seized his personal bank accounts, his investment portfolios, and the luxury silver SUV Vanessa had proudly driven onto my property. He was officially, permanently bankrupt, without Trent's fraudulent income to subsidize her extravagant lifestyle. Vanessa crashed violently into the unforgiving reality of the working class, because Trent had cross-collateralized their primary residence to fund his failing commercial ventures. The federal bank initiated an immediate, aggressive foreclosure on the sprawling suburban home. Federal marshals arrived on a Tuesday morning, handing Vanessa an official notice granting her exactly 7 days to vacate the premises. There were no luxury moving services to pack her belongings this time, with her joint bank accounts frozen by federal regulators investigating the fraud. She was forced to pawn her designer handbags, her diamond wedding ring, and her expensive patio furniture to a local broker just to secure a cash deposit on a cramped, two-bedroom apartment. The unit was situated directly next to a noisy industrial park, the floorboards vibrating every time a commercial freight truck drove past the single-pane windows. I did not have to imagine her misery. The local gossip mill supplied the details with ruthless efficiency. Vanessa, the woman who had loudly demanded a master suite facing the ocean because her fertility supposedly entitled her to luxury, was now hauling cheap plastic grocery bags up 3 flights of concrete stairs. She had no luxury vehicle to drive her children to expensive extracurricular activities. She spent her days navigating public transportation, forced to wear faded sweatpants instead of pristine white jeans. She was completely isolated from the wealthy suburban mothers who had instantly deleted her phone number the moment her husband's mugshot hit the evening news. The unearned luxury she had used to mock my quiet life had evaporated in a matter of days. Barbara suffered an entirely different brand of devastation. She was not currently sitting in a federal cell. But the social prison she found herself trapped inside was arguably much worse for a woman whose entire identity revolved around perceived status. The federal agents had kept their promise. They had interviewed the president of her country club and the leaders of her church congregation, presenting the toxic voicemails and defamatory social media posts as undeniable evidence of federal witness tampering and coercion. The backlash was instantaneous and absolute. The board of directors at the country club convened an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to revoke her membership, citing a strict zero-tolerance policy for criminal involvement. Her name was physically scraped off the brass donor plaque in the main lobby, leaving nothing but a scarred, empty rectangle on the wood paneling. When Barbara attempted to attend Sunday services the following week, desperately hoping to spin a narrative of a suffering mother enduring a terrible misunderstanding, she was met with a suffocating, impenetrable wall of silence. The women she had gossiped with for decades turned their backs the moment she walked into the foyer. The charity committees she had chaired removed her name from their letterheads. During a Tuesday afternoon trip to the local high-end grocery store, Barbara attempted to approach a former friend in the produce aisle, forcing a wide, artificial smile. The woman simply looked at Barbara's shaking hands, turned her shopping cart around, and walked entirely in the opposite direction without speaking a single syllable. The community had read the published reports detailing how Barbara provided the brass key to break into my childhood lockbox. They knew she had actively conspired to steal her own daughter's inheritance. She was completely shunned, permanently branded as a toxic, manipulative criminal. The crushing weight of her social exile forced her to remain hidden inside her suburban home, keeping the blinds drawn tight against the world she could no longer participate in. Eventually, she was forced to list her own home for sale just to cover the exorbitant legal retainer required for her impending federal conspiracy trial. She moved into a small, dark condominium on the outskirts of the city, utterly invisible. They had tried to strip me of my sanctuary because they deemed my childless life unworthy, and in return, the justice system stripped them of absolutely everything they owned. 6 months later, the crisp autumn breeze rolled off the Atlantic, carrying the salty, peaceful scent of absolute freedom. I sat in a heavy Adirondack chair on the wraparound cedar deck, a thick wool blanket draped across my lap to block the coastal chill. The ocean churned in deep shades of navy and steel, crashing rhythmically against the pristine shoreline. Resting on the small wooden table beside my steaming mug of black tea was a thick, bound stack of federal court transcripts. The justice system moves slowly, but when presented with an undeniable, fully documented digital audit, it moves with the crushing, inescapable weight of an avalanche. I reached out and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover of the transcript, tracing the final sentencing remarks delivered by the federal magistrate just 2 days prior. Trent did not get the opportunity to charm a jury with his bespoke suits or his arrogant, practiced smile, Faced with the undeniable Internet Protocol logs, the high-resolution forged quitclaim deed, and the time-stamped wire transfers of the $2.5 million commercial bailout, his high-priced public defender had strongly advised him to accept a blind plea. The judge showed absolutely zero leniency, reading the courtroom observer notes. I visualized the scene with crystal clarity. The magistrate highlighted Trent's staggering, sociopathic hubris, noting how he knowingly leveraged federally protected environmental land to satisfy his own reckless, toxic corporate debt. The gavel struck the sound block with terrifying finality, sentencing Trent to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. When the sentence was read, Trent's legs gave out entirely. He collapsed against the heavy wooden defense table, sobbing violently, his wrists bound by heavy steel chains. The man who had strutted into my kitchen demanding my eviction will spend the next 2 decades confined to a concrete cell measuring 6 by 8 feet. He is completely stripped of his luxury watches and his unearned pride. His hands, which once arrogantly slid fraudulent purchase agreements across my granite island, now scrub industrial cafeteria trays for exactly 12 cents an hour. Vanessa did not escape the blast radius. As a direct co-conspirator who physically traced my signature onto the forged document, she faced severe federal felony charges because the state did not want to place her 3 children into the foster care system. The prosecutor offered her a highly restrictive plea deal. She received 5 years of strict federal probation, permanently tethered to a bulky, restrictive ankle monitor that dictates her every movement. Her daily reality is a suffocating prison of its own making. Stripped of the luxury silver vehicle and the sprawling suburban estate, she remains trapped in that cramped, 2-bedroom apartment beside the deafening industrial park. To satisfy the massive court-ordered financial restitution, the woman who once scoffed at my career is now working 50 hours a week as a cashier at a discount retail warehouse. Her manicured nails are chipped, cracked, and completely ruined. Her expensive designer blouses have been replaced by a stiff, synthetic, bright red employee uniform. She spends her days standing on her feet on a concrete floor, ringing up groceries for the exact same suburban women she used to desperately try to impress at her country club luncheons. The unearned luxury she demanded is nothing but a ghost, completely eradicated by her own blinding greed. Barbara suffered the most profound psychological destruction. The matriarch who worshipped social status above her own daughters was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security federal prison camp for conspiracy and witness tampering. The transcripts detailed her final moments in the courtroom. She did not look at the judge, she looked frantically at the gallery. Searching for any sympathetic faces from her former social circle, she found none. The very women she had weaponized against me during her ruthless public smear campaign had provided the sworn testimonies that ultimately sealed her conviction. When the federal marshals approached to take her into custody, Barbara wept, begging them not to put the handcuffs on her in public. They ignored her pleas. She was systematically stripped of her pearls and her tailored blazers, forced into a standard-issue, shapeless khaki uniform. She now spends her days sweeping the concrete walkways of a federal compound, entirely invisible to the outside world. Her precious reputation, the social standing she valued more than basic human decency, is permanently reduced to a digital mugshot in a federal database. I closed the heavy court transcript, aligning the edges perfectly before placing it back on the wooden table. I did not feel a single pang of guilt. I took a slow sip of my hot tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I looked out over the sprawling, $1.2 million coastal estate that Elias Thorne had entrusted to me. The ancient maritime oaks swayed gently in the wind. The protected dunes remained completely undisturbed, a permanent sanctuary shielded by federal law. For a decade, my family had aggressively demanded my silent sacrifices. They treated my quiet, childless life as a void they were entirely entitled to fill with their endless financial crises and emotional demands. They weaponized the concept of family, twisting the word selfish to extract my hard-earned resources while offering absolutely zero respect in return. They mistook my patience for weakness. They assumed my quiet, Accommodating nature meant I lacked a spine. But an auditor does not need to scream to dismantle a fraud. We simply let the numbers, the documents, and the undeniable facts speak for themselves. I did not have to lower myself to their level of chaotic, hysterical abuse. I simply laid out the absolute limits of my boundaries and allowed their own towering arrogance to push them over the precipice. True power is not loud. It does not require bespoke suits or a stolen silver SUV to validate its existence. True power is the quiet, unbreakable certainty of knowing exactly what you are worth, and absolutely refusing to subsidize the lives of people who treat you like a disposable asset. Take a hard look at the people demanding your sacrifices today, and never be afraid to let them read the fine print of your boundaries. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share your own stories of standing up to toxic entitlement in the comments below.